Russia is a country at war. Hearing this sentence, your natural instinct will probably be to think of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which has escalated into the largest European conflict since World War II. But what if we told you that another war rages quietly within Russia's own borders, almost as long as the conflict with Ukraine itself? That's right, Russia isn't just fighting Ukraine, it's also fighting itself. In one corner, the entrenched elite, struggling to maintain their grip on a fractured empire. In another, a rising wave of discontent and resistance, challenging the very foundations of that empire. While this war isn't one of headlines and grand military maneuvers, it's just as consequential for the future of the Russian nation, if not more. This is the story of Russia's silent civil war. When it comes to inter-country wars, the situation is pretty clear-cut. There's usually a well-defined cause, straightforward objective, generally understood rules of engagement, and easily identifiable enemies. The battles are fought with weapons, and the outcomes are measured by territorial gains and losses, as well as direct battle deaths. In a civil war, on the other hand, all rules and boundaries are blurred. That's what makes each civil war a unique phenomenon. Still, some common elements often emerge, even amidst the chaos. In most civil wars, there's some kind of prior conflict, a simmering issue that's gradually escalated. This can be a historical grievance, as was the case with the American Civil War, long-standing political corruption like the one fueling the Syrian War, or deep social and economic inequalities that have been suppressed but never fully addressed, which led to some major bloodshed in conflicts like the Rwandan Civil War. Russia's silent civil war is unique in this regard, as the prior conflict in question is an external one, the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Russia's military engagement with Ukraine has had profound internal repercussions, creating growing divisions within the country itself. But why? Isn't the invasion of Ukraine just a special military operation aiming to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, as Russia's President Vladimir Putin put it? Of course not. As soon as Kyiv didn't immediately fall when faced with 190,000 Russian troops and tens of thousands of its vehicles, the so-called special operation became a very real war. A war that fought to strip a democratic country of its very statehood and its people of their identity. But as much as Putin tried to spout a narrative about the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, calling them one people, the harsh reality was far different. So the Russian people soon started to catch on. It's not about liberation, it's about domination. And so Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 pushed forward a long-standing decline, one that has been underway for 20 years, in democratic freedoms, media autonomy, and civil society at home. In the words of Konstantin Eggert, an exiled Russian journalist, the war in Ukraine finally allowed Putin and his crowd to introduce a uniform ideology in Russia, which they always dreamt of introducing, but they couldn't do it because they were supposed to play democracy. Sure, this supposed democracy has always been somewhat of a facade, but as the Russian author Grigory Kartashvili, who goes by the pen name Boris Akunin, puts it, Russia was a troubled, chaotic democracy, an interesting country where a lot of things were happening. Now it's become totally Kafkaesque, Orwellian. And in such an autocratic regime, a civil war is almost inevitable, especially considering how poorly the Russian government treats its people. On the one hand, there are soldiers fighting in Ukraine whose role in this war can be best summed up in two words: cannon fodder. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as many as 592,000 Russian troops have either been killed or injured, according to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. That's 10 times more than the total number of casualties of the Soviet Union's decade-long invasion of Afghanistan. Add the thousands of people missing or left behind in Ukraine, and it becomes clear that the human cost of Putin's brutal war is staggering. But how is this possible? Sure, the Ukrainians have been fighting fearlessly, beyond what many could have imagined. They're also supported by Western allies, with the US alone donating over $40 billion in military aid until February 29, 2024. However, the main reason Russia is suffering such heavy losses is Russia itself. Since the invasion started, the Kremlin made one reckless decision after another. First, it was the so-called partial mobilization of the Russian reservists in the fall of 2022, when 300,000 people were forced to join the army, clearly showing how bad the invasion was going only 7 months in. Vice News, a long-form news content unit with the Canadian-American media outlet Vice, visited a Russian theater-turned-draft center, processing some 100 recruits a day to gauge the reaction of those being conscripted. The conscription itself was never the problem. After all, in times of war, mobilizing additional troops is a common practice. The real issue lay in the execution and the underlying conditions that accompanied this mobilization. To start, the soldiers were only given 24 hours to report for duty, a stark contrast to the usual 3 days they previously received to say goodbye to their loved ones. In this scenario, conscripts living in a different city didn't even have a chance to kiss their parents goodbye. And even if their families managed to reach the draft center in time to say goodbye, they were only given 3 minutes to do so. 3 minutes to convey the gravity of their departure, share heartfelt words, and offer an embrace, all while fearing that it might be the last one ever. Still, many conscripts only spoke highly of their duty, either out of true blind faith or fear to speak critically of the war, which has since become a criminal offense. Alexei, a young conscript soldier interviewed by Vice, shared that he felt proud of his country and the fact he didn't shun his duty. He added he was ready to defend his motherland, not doubting for a second that it would emerge victorious. When asked whether he was willing to give his life for his motherland, his answer was affirmative, emphasizing that pride and courage are the most important things. If the Kremlin appropriately rewarded Alexei and others like him, these strong patriotic sentiments might have been sustained or even amplified. But what the Kremlin did instead was send the fresh recruits into battle with poor training, poor equipment, and worst of all, poor leadership. So video after video started emerging from the Ukrainian battlefield. New soldiers carrying rusty rifles, fresh recruits bringing their own makeshift medical kits, units sent to the front line within days of entering Ukraine despite having no formal training, commanders being drunk while their men died. Even getting badly injured in the war didn't guarantee better treatment. Most of the injured soldiers didn't receive proper therapy, and some of them were sent back to the front lines to fight. They were adding insult to literal injury. Given the horrifying reports coming from Ukraine, it shouldn't be surprising that many veterans deemed this war significantly worse than Chechnya, Georgia, or any other conflict modern Russia took part in. It also shouldn't be surprising that the war in Ukraine dealt a massive blow to the patriotism of even the most ardent supporters of the Kremlin. After all, when their country needed help, they stepped up. Yet they were only rewarded with an unrelenting cycle of disappointment and suffering. The more the abysmal treatment of the Russian soldiers became public, the worse the reactions to it got. At first, thousands of Russians fled the country to escape suffering the same fate, but then protests erupted. Military recruitment centers were set on fire. A conscription officer was even shot in Siberia. One would think that these alarming reactions would be a wake-up call for the Kremlin, but that person would be oh so terribly wrong. The Kremlin only doubled down on its repressive measures, awarding undeserving generals with medals while feeding the soldiers to the meat grinder. The government also intensified its crackdown on dissent, implemented stricter laws, and tightened control over information. In a grim display of authoritarianism, the regime pursued harsh penalties for those caught protesting in any way, squashing any trace of freedom of expression. The deepening repression underscored a regime more concerned with maintaining its grip on power than addressing the genuine grievances and dire conditions facing its people. Some 30 years ago, cases of treason were quite rare in Russia. Now anyone could be declared a traitor, be it a foreigner or a Russian citizen. In 2023 alone, there were over 100 known treason cases in Russia, reminding us of many of the infamous show trials and purges of the Stalinist era. The trials of the Putin era all shared similar characteristics. They were held behind closed doors. The specific charges and evidence supposedly secured by Russia's Federal Security Service or FSB were always shrouded in secrecy. The trials always resulted in convictions and lengthy prison terms. Many of the traitors, spies, and saboteurs, as Putin labeled the barrage of alleged enemies of the state, simply found themselves on the wrong side of an increasingly paranoid regime. And so Ivan Safronov, an advisor to the Roscosmos space agency and former military affairs journalist, was sentenced to 22 years in prison in 2022 for treason. Safronov denied these charges, insisting they were nothing but retaliation for his reporting on the military. Interestingly, his father, Ivan Ivanovich Safronov, also a journalist, died after falling from the 5th floor of his Moscow apartment building in 2007. Although his death was ruled a suicide, there were widespread suspicions that Ivan Ivanovich's death was not accidental. Many believed he was targeted for his investigative work, which often exposed sensitive military issues. The parallels between the father's mysterious death and the son's harsh sentencing were hard to ignore, leading to speculation that the Safronov family had long been under scrutiny by the state. Other notable figures who suffered a similar fate as the Safronov family include physicist Dmitry Kolka, arrested in a hospital where he was treated for advanced pancreatic cancer for supposedly revealing state secrets in his lectures in China. After being taken to Lefatovo prison, his family was told he had died in a hospital there, raising questions about the harsh treatment of terminally ill prisoners. Physicist Valery Golobkin, accused of similar charges and sentenced to 12 years, reflecting a pattern of targeting academics and scientists under the pretext of protecting state secrets. physicist Anatoly Maslov sentenced to 14 years for treason, adding to the growing fear among the scientific community in Russia as more researchers became ensnared in what many viewed as politically motivated prosecutions. Politician Vladimir Kara-Murza sentenced to 25 years in prison for giving speeches critical of Russia in the West. Luckily, Kara-Murza was released on August 1, 2024, as part of the most extensive prisoner exchange between the US and Russia since the end of the Cold War. The Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich, sentenced to 16 years in prison on espionage charges. He was also one of 26 political prisoners released in the August 1 exchange. As a result of these horrifying persecutions, powerful voices standing up against Putin and his ruling elite are becoming a rarity. And who can blame them when speaking up can only get you in one of these three places: in prison, in exile, or 6 feet under. However, prominent Russian and foreign figures aren't the only ones Russia is waging a silent civil war against. The most horrific stories are coming from all corners of the country, where ordinary citizens are finding themselves ensnared in the Kremlin's web of repression. Sometimes for something as simple as holding a sign calling for peace, repeating a chant, and even reciting a poem. That's right, Artem Kamardin, a 33-year-old Russian amateur poet, was jailed and given a 7-year sentence for reciting a poem. But this was not before he was brutally beaten by Russian police, stripped naked, and ordered to ask for forgiveness on video, and even sexually assaulted with a metal bar. His fiancée, who was present for the brutal raid and later interviewed by Vice, was also threatened with sexual violence, with the Russian forces trying to glue her lips together to silence her screams. Similar horror stories have emerged from across the country, painting a chilling picture of the Russian state's systematic crackdown on dissent. These accounts reveal a regime that has abandoned any pretense of justice or humanity, instead resorting to sheer brutality to maintain control. According to an independent media and human rights defense group focused on Russia, OVD Info, over 260 people are currently serving jail terms for crimes related to taking an anti-war stance. This number is just a small fraction of the staggering 20,040 people who've been detained for the same reason since February 24, 2022. There have also been 622 cases of extrajudicial pressure for an anti-war stance, as well as 1,206 cases of pressure on media workers and journalists. Another figure of note is the 45 repressive laws introduced since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Most of these laws, 26 of them, deal with the so-called foreign cooperation and foreign agents. 10 of them target freedom of speech and expression, and 5 aim to regulate the internet. In some cases, sentences for the crimes committed under these laws are equal to those passed down for murder. As for the potential defendants under these laws, the list grows longer by the day, and virtually anyone can make the list. As OVD Info lawyer and analyst Daria Korolenko puts it, they will imprison old people, they will imprison people who have disabilities, they will imprison people with children and women with children. They just want everyone to be silent. So Evgenia Mayboroda, a 72-year-old woman from Russia's Rostov region, was jailed for 5.5 years in early 2023 for spreading false information about the Russian army on social media. The false information in question, an emotional video about the number of Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine. All things considered, it shouldn't be surprising that one of the prominent individuals jailed for his words, Oleg Orlov, described Russia as sinking deeper and deeper into this darkness at an ever-quickening pace. And in this darkness, there's no room for accurate media reporting or democratic institutions, so the Kremlin has been on a mission to dismantle both, sending more clear messages that a Russian civil war is underway. As far as media goes, a severely damaged information space is nothing new for Russia. Every special operation, conducted by the state, Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, has been accompanied by a purge of the media space. However, this de facto military censorship has reached new heights after the invasion of Ukraine. The goal is clear: to irreversibly break the flow of independent information and ensure that only the Kremlin's narrative prevails. As a result, a new, alternate reality has been created by the Kremlin, one where the Kremlin is supported by the majority of people, where Russia is the liberator and Ukraine is the oppressor. The Ukrainian people are vile, fascist Nazis, committing genocide against the Russian people. Even Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president and a Jewish person, is a Nazi. These messages are plastered all over, on state-run TV channels, news bulletins, and nationwide billboards. As Korolenko puts it, the climate is fed by the mainstream media that everyone is a spy and a traitor, foreign agent. Everyone wants to destroy Russia, destroy your home. Besides utilizing the Russian people against the common enemy, these campaigns are also trying to persuade them to join the army voluntarily, often playing on male fragility. Do you want to be a hero, a true patriot, or a spineless coward? But you see, these tried-and-true methods of manipulation and propaganda aren't as effective today as they were in the Soviet era. Why? 2 words: the internet. Russia's youth, more connected than ever through social media and alternative news sources, are increasingly exposed to diverse perspectives and information. Unlike the Soviet era, when state-controlled media was the sole source of news, today's digital age allows for rapid dissemination of uncensored information and alternative viewpoints. So what does the Kremlin do? It focuses on the internet specifically, of course. The Kremlin is heavily investing in the Institute for Internet Development, or IID, whose goal is to essentially funnel nationalistic online content. In 2022, this organization received $163 million from the Russian state. In 2023, this figure rose to $217 million, while in 2024, it's expected to reach $282 million. All the online shows produced by the IRI are designed to reinforce the Kremlin's narrative and suppress dissenting views. These productions are aimed at saturating the digital landscape with state-approved content, trying to counteract the influence of independent and foreign media, which are desperately trying to show the Russian people the true cost of the war. Besides the internet, the only way people can find out what's truly happening in this information vacuum is through a series of somewhat unreliable Russian Telegram accounts. But many people don't need any official or unofficial sources of information to understand what's truly happening in their country. All they need to see is the increasing number of graves across the country, with families not even allowed to open coffins of their loved ones before burying them. Signs of unjust suffering are visible across Russia, so it's only a matter of time before the current silent civil war turns into a fully-fledged uprising. This possibility is only further supported by the pace at which Russian people are losing trust in the legitimacy of government institutions and the rule of law in Russia. The 2024 Russian presidential elections are the perfect example of this. After 3 days of voting, Putin reportedly won over 88% of the vote, getting re-elected as president for an unprecedented 5th time. In another drastic step away from democracy, Putin made amendments to the Russian constitution in 2020 to allow him to remain in power, potentially until 2036, when he would be 84 years old. Although Putin's victory was a foregone conclusion before the first ballot was even cast, the sheer scale of electoral fraud and manipulation was still astounding. Ballot stuffing, voter intimidation, busing Putin supporters to vote multiple times at different locations, forcing people to vote at gunpoint. There was nothing subtle about the efforts to skew the results in Putin's favor. Of course, there were still protests against the inevitable outcome. Thousands of Russians agreed to vote at noon on Sunday, thus symbolically supporting the late pro-democracy activist Alexei Navalny, who endorsed the Noon Against Putin plan on social media before he died. Others showed their discontent by spoiling their ballots and writing Navalny's name on them. Speaking of Navalny, many believed his death to be the conclusive phase of the country's regression toward authoritarian rule. Once Navalny, Putin's most prominent critic, was killed in February 2024, there was no going back. As Akunin explains it, by killing Alexei Navalny, they lost the last chance of trying to pretend that they were decent, law-abiding. Violence has now become the central pillar of the Russian state, and no matter how the war in Ukraine ends, the trajectory of the Kremlin's authoritarian regime seems unalterable. As long as the Kremlin is fighting its own people, violence won't dissipate from Russia. With this in mind, a question instantly arises. Will this silent civil war grow into an all-out uprising? Quite possibly. Although the country's regime's brutal tactics are aimed at preventing this, they might just push the ordinary Russian people over the edge, thus having the opposite effect. After all, Russia was already on the brink of a fully-fledged civil war in June of 2023. This is when the infamous Wagner Group rebellion took place, checking all the boxes for an impending civil war. A fragmentation of security forces, loyalty shifts, the rise of armed groups' activity, escalating civil unrest. Prior to the rebellion, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, a private military company whose fighters have taken part in brutal conflicts all over Africa and the Middle East, openly and publicly criticized the Russian leadership for their poor handling of the invasion and inadequate support for the troops. He reported news straight from the front lines, earning international recognition. While Prigozhin's true motives can be debated, one thing was for certain: he showed the true state of the Russian military and its leadership. He labeled the Russian parliament members as useless, saying they should be the ones to go to the front first. Prigozhin didn't mince his words when talking about the commanders of the Russian army too, proclaiming they should be sent to the front barefoot with just a submachine gun. He particularly taunted Russia's former Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, calling him lazy and blaming him for the unnecessary full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. According to Prigozhin, the invasion of Ukraine was launched because Shoigu and his oligarch friends became greedy for more Ukrainian territories, causing them to push the Russian military into a pointless war that took hundreds of thousands of their lives. Prigozhin's message was clear. The evil brought by the military leadership of the country must be stopped. So he set out to do just that. Insults and call-outs turned into a full-blown rebellion in June 2023, when Prigozhin and 25,000 of his Wagner Group forces launched an unprecedented armed insurrection against the Kremlin. They started by seizing Rostov-on-Don, a Russian city a couple of miles from the Ukrainian border. Prigozhin posted a video of himself in the courtyard of the Southern Military District headquarters in the city, dispelling any doubts about his intentions. Interestingly, even on the eve of this insurrection, Putin reportedly didn't believe that it would ever actually happen, showing just how disconnected he'd become from the internal dissent brewing within his ranks. His disbelief underscored a dangerous complacency, allowing the rebellion to gain momentum and catch the Kremlin off guard. The Wagner Group rebellion was characterized by a rapid and audacious march toward Moscow, Russia's capital, seizing some military and administrative installations along the way. The armored columns bound for Moscow consisted of 5,000 to 8,000 combatants with tanks, armored vehicles, anti-aircraft weaponry, and civilian trucks. According to reports, the closest the Wagner Group got to Moscow was some 59 miles south of the city, reaching the town of Kashira. However, the only visual confirmation places Prigozhin's troops in Krasnoye in northern Lipetsk Oblast, 210 miles south of Moscow. Regardless of how far the Wagner Group got, it was clear that the sudden rebellion severely rattled the Kremlin and exposed significant vulnerabilities within the Russian state. The Wagner Group's advance, even if it didn't quite reach Moscow, demonstrated the capacity for serious internal dissent and the potential for rapid and destabilizing action in war-torn Russia. After almost 2 full days of advances, Prigozhin accepted a deal with Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko to prevent bloodshed. The deal was for the Wagner Group to cease any advancement and return to the base in exchange for a guarantee of its safety. If you're wondering why Lukashenko was the one to broker the deal, it's because Putin refused to speak to Prigozhin, who he once saw as a powerful ally. Putin previously denounced Prigozhin, though not by name, stating, "Exorbitant ambitions and personal interests have led to treason." And by now you know how Putin responds to treason at the highest level. Exactly 2 months after the Wagner Group rebellion, Prigozhin's airplane en route from Moscow to St. Petersburg crashed, killing all 10 people inside, including Prigozhin and several senior Wagner members. Though there were some claims that the aircraft was shot down by Russian air defenses over Tver Oblast, Western intelligence believed that an explosion on board was the culprit. Either way, the man who so publicly defied Putin and challenged the Kremlin's authority was no more. In the year since, the Kremlin has effectively dismantled the Wagner Group, placing the ex-Wagner troops across the Russian state. The goal was to eliminate a single person in charge, thus neutralizing any potential resurgence of organized resistance. Although some observers believed the Wagner Group would be eliminated, this was never going to happen. For one, Russia can't afford to lose any more soldiers, especially those as well trained and experienced as the Wagner troops. According to the US National Security Council, as many as 50,000 Wagner mercenaries were fighting in Ukraine at one point, underscoring just how crucial they are for the war effort. But also, the Wagner Group has historically been incredibly important for the Russian state, both geopolitically and economically, making it an invaluable asset beyond the war in Ukraine. With the dismantling of the Wagner Group, it's safe to say that no potential Putin adversary is strong enough to consolidate power and challenge his grip on the Kremlin, for now at least. Given how fast Russia is fracturing into power blocks and how seemingly willing the Kremlin is to target its own people, the situation in Russia remains volatile, and that's the understatement of the century. But what do you think? Is Russia inevitably heading for a full-scale civil war once its citizens finally reach a breaking point and rise against the regime's oppressive tactics? Or will the Kremlin's heavy-handed control and strategic dispersal of dissenters prevent such a scenario from unfolding?
This is the biggest country on planet Earth, with a total area of 6,601,665 square miles and a land area of 6,322,142 square miles. It represents 11% of the total world's landmass and is 1.8 times larger than America. But Russia isn't just a big country, it's a big problem. And if it collapses as a result of the consequences of the war in Ukraine, this will impact everybody, everywhere. Yes, even you. But why? And in what way? Let's find out. Send in the tanks. If you can find any. Russia has always prided itself on its Victory Day celebration. Held to commemorate the Soviet victory over the Nazis in World War II, the bombastic parade held annually in Red Square has historically served as a visual barometer of Russian military power. It is common to see rows upon rows of marching soldiers, jets, tanks, armored vehicles, and intercontinental ballistic missiles file past an absorbed crowd and its approving leadership. This year, things were a little different. The Kremlin scaled things back, like a lot. There was no flyover, there were no Iskanders, there were 3,000 fewer soldiers, most of them cadets and students at local military universities. And rather than a steady stream of T-90Ms, T-14 Armatas, a solitary World War II vintage T-34 tank motored past the reviewing stand. For how staggering Russian tank losses have been in the Ukraine thus far, it's tempting to think this T-34 is actually the bottom of the barrel for Putin's forces. After all, having lost 192 tanks in the First Chechen War, 23 tanks in the Second Chechen War, and 3 tanks in the Russo-Georgian War, Russia has now lost an impressive 1,937 tanks in Ukraine thus far as of May 2023. And that is just how many have been visually confirmed. Just let that sink in. There are more tanks yet in Russia's arsenal, but most of them are currently employed in Ukraine, along with the lion's share of its military forces, explaining the humbler military parade presence than years past. Factor in the recent drone scare over the Kremlin, and we can see that this year's parade was held despite legitimate strategic red flags and security concerns unfathomable just 1 year ago. Some say the event, designed to capture the public's imagination and promote the heady militaristic nationalism of the Soviet glory days, is merely papering over the cracks in Russia's armed forces. Of these, there are many. The irony is that the last time the Russian military orchestrated a military victory of any consequence was exactly 78 years ago during World War II. Today, its operations in Ukraine are on track to follow a more common Russian pattern of strategic overstretch and ignominious withdrawal. There are increasing warning signs that the weaknesses we are seeing are evidence of far graver threats to Putin's regime. Recently, Yevgeny Prigozhin, chief of the Wagner mercenary group fighting around Bakhmut in Ukraine, criticized the Kremlin for not sending enough ammunition to make a difference on the front lines. "Victory Day is the victory of our grandfathers," he vented on social media. "We haven't earned that victory 1 millimeter." It should surprise no one that victory now looks far from attainable. On the contrary, in the light of economic sanctions and the declining financial health of the Russian Federation, some are predicting far worse for Putin's forces and his political future. With less to be positive about now than at any point in the war, could Putin's regime actually be on the brink of collapse? And what might that look like? In a recent survey of 167 foreign policy experts held by the Atlantic Council, 46% of them believed that the collapse or disintegration of Russia could happen in the next 10 years. 40% claimed that this would happen internally for a number of reasons, particularly because of a revolution, civil war, or political disintegration. We all know that wars gone awry can exacerbate and expedite the deterioration of a society faster than just about anything else. But Putin's abysmal strategic direction of Russia's war in Ukraine could have the country on the fast track to obscurity, oblivion, or far, far worse, outright dissolution. There are 2 prime historical touchpoints in modern history we tend to reference when we talk about a Russian political collapse, which is really saying something if you think about it. The first is the most recent, when the Soviet Union broke apart at the end of the Cold War. In case you're too young to remember, this collapse caught the world by surprise. Many were shocked to see a country so large and powerful, on paper at least, suddenly and rapidly fall apart. Some blame Russia's current state of affairs on the West's response to that significant geopolitical moment. Heralded as the start of a new era of freedom, liberation, and self-determination, many worried the independence of a host of ex-Soviet satellites and the weakening of Russia would destabilize the international order. Since the 1990s, all of the Soviet Union's 21 constituent republics declared themselves sovereign. Putin, a staunch imperialist who pines for the good old days, took this pretty hard. After he rose to power, the West tried to maintain dialogue and positive relations with the Kremlin, even as it embarked on a repressive imperialist foreign policy with deployments in the Second Chechen War, the 2008 invasion of Georgia, and the 2014 invasion of Ukraine. Since the end of the Cold War, Putin has created a regime that actively restricts the rights of the dozens of different national and ethnic groups within the boundaries of the modern Russian state. He wants to be a czar, with a wheel of dependent satellites to exploit for natural resources, manpower, and money. Russian officials and Kremlin propagandists have made it their goal to promote this agenda, making the ruthless look benign. Someday, who is to say Moldova, Kazakhstan, or other Central Asian nations might not come under the tighter thumb of Russian imperial aggression? What would it mean for European security? That's why Ukraine matters. The war there poses serious problems for Putin's imperial ambitions. He and his cabinet thought it would be a short war, one that would permanently bring Ukraine back into Russia's orbit. Instead, he is suffering one of the most catastrophic military setbacks of the past 100 years, one that has already surpassed the devastation caused by the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and one approaching the scale with the type of suffering that preceded the other major Russian collapse, the collapse of the Tsarist Empire in 1917. That, in case you forgot, was the first time the Russian Federation dissolved, the event that triggered Russia's chaotic, bloody descent into Soviet-era communism. And let me tell you, it was a whirlwind of a time to be alive. One moment you are a Russian soldier, fighting Germany and Austria-Hungary with the Entente allies on the Eastern Front. The next, you learn the inefficient and widely corrupt Tsarist government can no longer sustain the economic and material costs of the war effort. Before you know it, tens of thousands of soldiers, workers, and peasants are fed up, rising up, overthrowing the imperial government and installing the Bolsheviks in power. Countless Russian minorities yearned in those turbulent times for some form of recognition and freedom, which had been elusive under the Tsars. When the empire disintegrated and crashed out of the war, social, economic, and socio-political ruptures terminated the central control of the state and enabled the temporary formation of a series of new polities, including the Siberian Republic and other former territories that got their first taste of independence. These include Finland, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. It wouldn't be long before the Soviets, consolidating state power once more under the communist flag of the USSR, gobbled them back up. And you wonder why they were more than happy to join NATO in the aftermath of the Cold War. Most experts believe that a modern Russian collapse will be swifter, more brutal, and more akin to the revolutionary crisis of 1917 than the Soviet collapse of 1991. It is a possible scenario. The conditions in Russia today do bear a passing resemblance to those within the Tsarist Empire at the time of its fall, a deeply corrupt and morally bankrupt ruling class led by oligarchs, aristocrats, and elites with no conception of the economic suffering of the masses. Ethnic minorities in places like Dagestan, Ichkeria, Ingushetia, Ossetia, Kabardino, the Caucasus, Tuva, Buryatia, and others, inhumanely treated, discriminated against, and used as cannon fodder in Putin's wars. A population in serious demographic decline, growing mistrust of Russian institutions and governance, intensive state oppression, a country that will owe billions, if not trillions of dollars, to rebuild Ukraine when the time comes. If you think any singular cause will cause Putin's downfall, you'd be wrong. History is non-linear, multi-causal, and contingent. Janusz Bagashki, author of Failed State, A Guide to Russia's Rupture, put it best. The demise of the current Russian Federation is unlikely to follow a single path. Unlike that of the Soviet Union, where 15 Union republics became independent states almost by default, the fracturing of the state is likely to be chaotic, prolonged, sequential, conflictive, and increasingly violent. It can result in the full separation of some federal units and the amalgamation of others into new federal or confederal arrangements. Bruno Tertrace, an advisor for geopolitics at the Institut Montaigne, has argued that the only good thing about a Russian collapse today is that the nuclear issue would be far less serious than it was with the Soviet Union. Elites would be far more interested in preserving some semblance of authority and power rather than commit political and personal suicide by launching a nuclear attack. Most of Russia's nuclear forces today are inside the Federation, not beyond its borders like during the Cold War, when it had 7,000 nukes stationed outside Russia. Exploring the implications for Russia's future as a nuclear power if trends continue the way they are, Bruno observed, in the 1970s the Soviet Union was described as Upper Volta with rockets, he said. By the 2000s it was Mexico with nuclear weapons. In 2010s, a gas station with nuclear weapons. Will it become a Somalia with nuclear weapons? So how exactly might Russia collapse? What would it mean for its neighbors? We know that a country's foreign policy is a reflection of its domestic situation, and vice versa. In Russia's case, Putin's actions have the country on the path to economic Armageddon. The price of Russian crude oil is the lowest it's been in years. Within the first 2 months of 2023, the state had already fallen into a deficit level normally achieved in an entire year. It isn't profiting much from its sale of hydrocarbons to India and China. Its import sales are collapsing. Its GDP has shrunk by 4%. Air cargo fell by 60% in 2022. There has been a massive loss of technical expertise and specialized equipment as foreign corporations and businesses fled the country. It lacks vital semiconductors and other specialized machinery imported from the West, meaning its entire economy, to say nothing of its military power, is becoming more and more primitive. The net result is an increasing reliance on states like China for resources and technology, systems that can be integrated but take time. While that happens, poverty will spread, it will be harder to receive good healthcare, and the population will grow more discontent with the government. These factors could affect the strength of existing national movements or ethnic minorities within the Russian Federation seeking greater independence and autonomy. Moscow is far removed from many of these population centers and has, until now, relied on a technocratic system of oligarchical control where Kremlin-appointed elites receive massive checks to keep their provinces in line. These leaders, in turn, return the regional profits to the Kremlin's coffers. Russian elites are deeply dependent on Moscow's political and economic authority for their own legitimacy. When this goes bankrupt, what happens? When the public loses faith in these Kremlin-appointed governors and the Kremlin can no longer provide them with the support they need to maintain order, there's a chance that local separatist movements will grow. In resource and industrial-rich regions, there might be the temptation to cut ties with Moscow and go it alone with the support of the people. This happened in 2020, when mass protests erupted in eastern Khabarovsk after the arrest and 22-year imprisonment of Sergei Furgal, a member of the opposition party. This caused a power vacuum that Moscow had to fill. But it needs resources and support to do so. And with the war dragging on and the bite of sanctions becoming more and more acute, it is increasingly likely that Putin will struggle to plug the holes in the dike as the flood of discontent spreads. Unlike the Soviet Union, whose power rested on the Comintern and whose governing authority always had a reasonably clear line of succession, nobody knows what will happen in Putin's vertical, highly centralized hierarchy if the figurehead falls. Will there be a civil war? Will a power struggle ensue between Putin's elites? Will Moscow, already neck-deep in its military invasion of Ukraine, have the resources to suppress any separatist movements that arise? Back in 1917, this was the avenue that led to the downfall of the Tsarist Empire. Like falling dominoes, the Ukrainian Central Rada presented its first universal declaration. 5 months later, it declared the creation of the Ukrainian People's Republic. Other regions did the same. By the time you get to 1918, the Red Army was forced to suppress these movements and bring them into submission. Only Poland, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, states with active support from the United States, Great Britain, and France, the victors of World War I, managed to secure their independence, if only for a time. The Bolsheviks managed to set the ship straight, but it came at a massive cost. Putin has to hope his cronies are as committed as the Bolsheviks were when his grasp on power is brought into question. So far, one of his tactics has been to feature minority participants in the Ukraine occupation like Kadyrov's Chechens in his propaganda campaign for two purposes: to both show Federation solidarity in the war and, if things go sour, to have a scapegoat for the Russian army's broader operational failures. If Russia collapsed, it would probably start with a breakaway movement in one territory that spreads like a virus to others on the country's periphery. Chechnya, for example, could be the first domino to fall. They have a history of enmity with the Kremlin, after all, and a recent one at that. Local elites like Kadyrov will be posturing for greater political power if they start to glimpse fractures in Putin's existing political system. Already struggling to deal with Ukraine, how might Russia deal with discontented Chechen and Wagner mercenaries who, more loyal to the cult of their own determined rulers than they are to Russia itself, come marching back to Moscow? Could these leaders, fueled by vengeful hatred for the way they were left to die on the battlefields of Ukraine with too few weapons, shells, and dilapidated equipment, form a Faustian pact and team up against Putin? Or will battlefield defeat and economic poverty force these sides into internecine warfare amongst themselves, a battle royale for ultimate political power? Okay, it might be a stretch, and we should temper our prognosis just a little. While it's tempting to look at online maps depicting the collapse of Russia by 2025, with fantastical graphics carving the country up into dozens of independent republics, the reality is that Russia's internal divisions are far less stark than they appear. According to Alexei Gusev, a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the maps betray a delusion on the part of their authors that is common to many political forecasters. These observers, all map fetishists, mistake the administrative boundaries of Russia's provinces for real borders of socio-economic life, unaware that the true divisions in Russian society almost never coincide with the arbitrary lines drawn by Communist Party functionaries in the first half of the last century. Russia is extremely unlikely to disintegrate along its regional borders for geographical, sociological, economical, and political administrative reasons. Sociologically, Gusev argues, most of Russia's regions share the same basic values and attitudes. For those praying for Putin's downfall, just know this: Russia always ends up rebuilding itself. Preferentially, a new, more egalitarian form of governance would emerge from the ashes. Historically, hardship, defeat, and political turmoil have been the breadbasket of totalitarianism. As long as Putin remains in power, it is unlikely that Russia's collapse will resemble the peaceful disintegration of 1991. Putin looks set to run, in air quotes, naturally for president again in 2024. He'll be familiar with essays by the likes of Ival Ilyin, who wrote in 1950 what dismemberment of Russia entails for the world. He knows that battlefield victories will all but seal his grip on power for decades to come. But with a hard year of campaigning ahead, one in which Ukraine will slowly integrate new Western weapon systems into its counteroffensive strategy, Putin will be forced to drain Russian resources further, sending young men to die on the front lines. Hatred will grow. Putin will be forced to suppress these feelings to prevent widespread discontent. This begins a vicious cycle in which the only thing that can save his dictatorship is more suppression, which leads to more discontent. And you see where this is going. Edward Lucas, senior advisor and senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, put it best: as the butcher's bill mounts in Ukraine, the war story contains only stale bombast. The lie machine insists that black is white. The result is cognitive dissonance between what Russians experience in their daily lives and what the state propaganda machine is telling them. As we know from Soviet times, that can last for a long time, but not indefinitely. The whiff of change is in the air. The truth, more than anything, is that the cracks in the Russian power pyramid have been present since Putin came to power. His actions over the past year have only accelerated a process of decline already long in motion. It is fighting an unwinnable war. If it refuses to pull out of Ukraine and rebuild its military, it will soon be unable to prevent those who want to leave the Federation from doing so. If the oligarchs turn on Putin, will there be a struggle between intelligence services, the National Guard, and foreign mercenaries? Will Putin be assassinated? Russia has committed several grave geopolitical blunders throughout the past 100 years. Could this be their worst? Could Putin survive politically or physically a military defeat?
Putin is done. Those are the words uttered by Peter Zeihan during a June 2024 interview with the Times Radio. Zeihan is an expert on geopolitics who has worked with Fortune 500 firms. The author of several books including The End of the World is Just Beginning and Disunited Nations, Zeihan made this claim in a reference to the future of both Putin and Russia's army. At various points during the interview, Zeihan argues that Putin is slowly losing his grip on power and that Ukraine is well positioned to launch a counteroffensive in the summer of 2024. That brings us to today's video. We're going to explore Zeihan's reasoning for his claims and highlight some of the issues that could lead to Putin ultimately losing the war in Ukraine. So is Putin really done? Zeihan's justifications for that claim start with the arrival of Patriot weapon systems and Western fighter jets in Ukraine. Starting with the Patriot systems, the Times Radio interviewer noted that the US had just announced that it would send another of those systems at a cost of $1.1 billion to Ukraine, adding that it's something that Ukraine badly needs. Each of these systems is capable of firing a 17-foot missile, with said munitions being equipped with a track-via missile targeting system that enables mid-course corrections while it's en route to its target. The missile can fly for 43 miles, reaching a maximum altitude of around 15 miles, and comes packed with a 198-pound warhead. They're extremely powerful weapons. Their manufacturer, RTX, says that Patriot missiles can intercept ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as take out drones and other advanced aerial threats. And it's this, Zehan claims, that makes the delivery of more of them such a vital win for Ukraine. He says that it's important for people to think of what these Patriot systems can offer Ukraine over the next several months, as opposed to considering what has been happening during the early stages of 2024. The Ukrainians needed more air defense, claims Zehan, and the Russians were taking advantage of a lull in weapons deliveries to basically hit the Ukrainians with all kinds of air-based weapon systems. With more Patriots, Ukraine can shore up its aerial defenses. They alone won't be enough, however, as Patriot missile systems can only cover a limited, albeit somewhat broad, area, even though they have a long firing range. Where they really become important in terms of Putin losing his grip on the territory Russia has claimed in Ukraine, says Zehan, is where they're used in combination with the Western fighter jets that are on their way to the country. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, NATO member nations have committed to sending at least 65 F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. These jets, which are anticipated to enter service toward the end of 2024, won't be enough to grant Ukraine total air superiority over its own territory. They're too few in number, and even though Russia's aerial offensives have faltered, could be overwhelmed with sheer numbers. Instead, these jets, along with a shipment of several Mirage 2000 jets from France, would allow Ukraine to create brief pockets of aerial superiority. Those pockets could make a massive difference, according to Zehan, who says that creating them massively increases the capacity of the Ukrainian military to launch strikes. Every offensive the Ukrainians have attempted for the last 12 months has bogged down because they don't have air superiority, Zehan says. That will change through a combination of Patriot missile systems and the arrival of Western fighter jets. For the first time since the war began, Ukraine will be able to conduct offensives with aerial support. That means ground troops will be able to move quickly and in large numbers because they face fewer threats from Russia's artillery. For example, Ukraine could use Patriot missiles to disable aerial threats while relying on its F-16s to take out the artillery that typically peppers Ukrainian troops as they attempt to advance. This approach would not require Ukraine to establish total aerial dominance. Instead, it would create pockets of superiority, allowing for troop movements and offensives that can retake positions Russia has claimed. Ukraine will have more time to do things like clear mines on the battlefield and prepare for its attacks. Those attacks will also be more coordinated because they're not starting in conditions where Ukrainian troops are simply trying to survive artillery barrages. The stage could thus be set for counteroffensives that retake Ukrainian territory. In short, Russia starts to lose territory thanks to Ukraine's stronger aerial threat. Of course, there's an obvious counterpoint to Zehan's argument here. What's to stop Russia from using its own anti-air defenses to prevent Ukraine from achieving these pockets of aerial superiority? The answer lies in the S-400 Triumph Surface-to-Air, or SAM, missile system. Designed by Russia and entering service in 2007, the S-400 is supposed to be somewhat equivalent to America's Patriot missile systems. Missile Threat says that it's capable of shooting down cruise missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, and aircraft, which should make it perfect for deploying against Ukraine's incoming F-16s. It's powerful too. Each S-400 missile can travel up to 248 miles and can carry a warhead weighing up to 315 pounds. Looking at the specifications alone, the S-400 is more powerful and rangier than Ukraine's Patriot missile systems, meaning that it should be more than capable enough of taking out F-16s and incoming missiles. But there's a problem. Russia has deployed S-400 systems frequently during the Ukraine war, and unfortunately for Putin, they've proven far less effective than Russia had anticipated. In September 2023, Newsweek reported that Ukraine was increasingly cutting away at Russia's supply of S-400s. The outlet reports that Russia had 96 of these SAM systems available at the beginning of 2023, with reports suggesting those numbers were being whittled down by the month. Quoting the Dutch open-source intelligence agency Oryx, Newsweek says that Russia had lost key components of at least 5 of its S-400 batteries in Crimea by September 2023. The situation has only gotten worse for Russia as the war moved into 2024. Writing for Forbes in June of that year, military commentator David Axe noted that a mid-May barrage of 10 Army tactical missile system rockets struck a base in Belbek within occupied Crimea. Each of these rockets weighed 2 tons and exploded to release hundreds of grenade-sized bomblets, creating a cluster bomb effect that devastated the Russian base. Among the equipment damaged there were 4 warplanes, along with a pair of S-400 launchers and a radar system. Russia replaced the S-400s. Ukraine bombed them again. This time, Ukraine took out 2 more S-400s, as well as one of Russia's older S-300 SAM systems. In short, Axe said, Ukraine is now in a position where it can take out Russia's S-400s as quickly as Russia can replace them in occupied Crimea. All of that brings us back to Zihan's claims that Putin is losing his grip on power. Russia is soon going to face a Ukraine that can not only establish limited pockets of aerial superiority, but can also take out the very anti-air defenses Russia relies upon to prevent that superiority from happening. Worse yet, the destruction of so many S-400s leaves Putin with egg on his face, as what's supposed to be the most advanced SAM unit in the world has proven to be extremely vulnerable to Ukrainian weapons. That's not just a problem for Putin in terms of his attempts to project Russian power. Incidents like these are also reducing the interest that other countries have in Russian weapons. Zihan highlights India as one of these nations, noting that the loss of so many S-400s is showing that Russia's weapons aren't as capable as advertised to the nations that were buying them. In India's case, Politico noted in April 2024 that Russia would practically lose all of its customers from India in the coming months. The war in Ukraine has exposed the fabled prowess of Russian weaponry as a myth, the report claims. In truth, India's imports of Russian weapons have been declining before the Ukraine war. Between 2009 and 19, 76% of India's weapon imports came from Russia. That number has dropped to just 36% during the last 5 years, with Politico noting that it's likely to fall to zero very soon. Given that India has earmarked $100 billion for future weapon procurement, Putin faces a doubly bad situation when it comes to selling his weapons. Russia's biggest customer is jumping ship, costing the country a huge slice of that $100 billion, and it's likely going to spend the bulk of that money on Western weapons instead. Russia is weakened and the West is empowered. That's the opposite of what Putin hopes to achieve with the Ukraine war, which was intended to be a projection of Russian power and a demonstration of the country's ability to easily win a war. Instead, Russia has been bogged down in a war of attrition that's seen it lose an aura of invulnerability that Putin has spent the last 2 decades cultivating. With that loss of the aura, Zihan suggests, may come the loss of Putin's hold over Russia. It gets even worse for Putin. Combine the loss of so many S-400 SAMs with the destruction of around a third of Russia's dreaded Black Sea fleet, and you have a situation in which Russia could conceivably lose Crimea. The region, which was controlled by Ukraine until Russia annexed it in 2014, is at risk of becoming a non-factor in the war due to Ukraine's tactics. Could it be just literally a matter of time until Ukraine can shut down Russia in Crimea, cutting it off and stopping Russia's ability to support the war from there? Zihan asks during the interview. Answering himself, he claims that is definitely the goal for Ukraine. However, even if Ukraine isn't able to liberate Crimea, Zihan notes, it's in a strong tactical position to at least damage it extensively. That would cause major problems for Russia on the logistical front, given that Crimea is one of the country's main routes into Ukraine. Zihan points out that Russia has 2 routes in and out of Crimea, a rail route that tracks through Mariupol and the Kerch Bridge. Both are vulnerable to Ukrainian strikes, with the latter having already been targeted. In April 2024, The Guardian reported that Ukraine had already conducted 2 drone strikes on the bridge, with a third likely being considered for some point in 2024. Zihan agrees that the bridge will likely be a target, noting that Ukraine could probably target and destroy it right now, but is likely waiting until it receives more military capacity. Why does this matter in the context of Putin's grip on power? When you do that, Crimea goes from being a launch pad for Russian assaults to simply the most vulnerable part of the Russian landmass, claims Zihan. The loss of Crimea, or merely the loss of the ability to use it to keep troops supplied on the Ukrainian mainland, would be a huge blow to Putin. Strategically, Russia's army would weaken due to the logistical problems Ukrainian strikes would create. With no bridges and destroyed rail routes, Russia would be forced to use its Black Sea fleet to ship supplies into Ukraine. A third of that fleet has already been destroyed. And thanks to Turkey's control over the Turkish Straits, which leads into the Black Sea, Russia is unable to replenish the Black Sea fleet with new ships. Putin would face a logistical disaster, and one that would only get worse as time went on and Ukraine destroyed more of the Black Sea fleet. Then there's the symbolic aspect of taking Crimea. If Ukraine is able to not only destroy logistical routes, but enter Crimea and retake it from Russia, Putin would experience a massive shot to his power projection. He will lose what he considers Russian territory, again seeing the aura of invulnerability that surrounded both him and Russia getting chipped away. Still, the taking of Crimea is far from an inevitability, and may not even be possible, unless Ukraine receives even more weapons. Even so, Putin is still in a position where Ukraine can damage Crimea, destroy Russia's logistical solutions, and take out ships and weapons that Putin believed would be effective in the war. Putin's grip on power loosens further. That brings us to another problem that Putin faces: Western nations allowing Ukraine to use weapons they supply inside Russia. Several have done so already, with the UK essentially claiming that Ukraine can use the missiles it supplies in whatever way they see fit, while Germany and the US have also given their seal of approval. In the case of the latter, that approval is conditional. Ukraine can only use American weapons in the Kharkiv region to strike Russia directly behind the border to prevent strikes in Kharkiv itself. The US has also taken things a step further. In June 2024, it lifted a decade-long ban on the Azov Brigade, which had barred the transfer of weaponry and the use of US-supplied training to the group. This was a controversial step. The ban was in place because the Azov Brigade has neo-Nazi origins, which Russia has taken full advantage of in its propaganda by claiming that the US is now flirting with Nazis to get what it wants. America thinks differently. It says the Azov Brigade has passed a series of stringent tests based on the Leahy vetting process, finding that there is no evidence of gross violations of human rights committed by the 12th Brigade Azov. What does this mean for Russia and Ukraine? Ukraine gets a huge boost, and the Azov Brigade is one of the most battle-hardened units and will offer advantages on the battlefield. As for Russia, the approval showcases that Western nations, particularly the US, are becoming less escalation-phobic as the war drags on. Zihan claims that these moves represent the US becoming even more willing to cross red lines in how it's dealing with Russia. Red line is a term used by the Russian Federation to refer to any geopolitical action that it believes could damage the country's position. The use of Western or NATO-provided weaponry within Russia is one of those red lines. So far, Zihan claims, the West has crossed 34 of these lines, with the use of Western military technology being the most recent. Why does crossing these red lines matter to Putin? The simple answer is that every instance of crossing a red line has been met with threats of retaliation by Russia. However, none of those threats have been realized. Zihan says that it's likely that Russia's red line threats were intended to slow down Western involvement, giving it more time to damage Ukraine, so the increasing crossing of them now represents the West taking a more aggressive approach to Russia. So Putin now faces a twofold problem that could weaken his grip on power. With Western approval, Ukraine has already started striking targets within Russia. Zihan brings up Ukraine's targeting of a radar system nestled a couple of hundred miles within Russia that was designed to help with ballistic missile defense. Those types of strategic assets are now on the table for Ukraine, meaning it can not only chip away at the Russian war machine within its territory, but also take out supporting equipment inside Russia. The result is the opening up of more opportunities for Ukrainian counteroffensives due to the weakening of Russia's military. Secondly, and perhaps far more worryingly for Putin, the West's willingness to allow Ukraine to use its weapons suggests that the West no longer takes him seriously. At least not so seriously that it believes his threats of imminent retaliation for crossing a red line. This doesn't mean that the West believes war with Russia isn't possible in the future. Even as far back as January 2024, NATO officials were claiming that the organization needed to be ready for war. That month saw NATO Military Committee Chief Rob Bauer claim, "We have to realize it's not a given that we are in peace, and that's why we are preparing for a conflict with Russia." So the problem for Putin isn't that the West flat out doesn't believe he might retaliate, it's that the West is getting ready to fight back, meaning Putin's constant attempts to project power are failing. And that brings us to another of Zihan's justifications for his opinion that Putin is losing his grip on power. The Russian political system is built around the concept of a strongman. Russian politics are quirky, claims Zihan. It's a strongman system, and it's always been a strongman system. Putin specifically rules through the intelligence service, which is a combination of the rule of terror and the rule of infiltration. While that form of rule is fairly stable, in the sense that it allows Putin to generally get what he wants done, it's also fairly brittle. One big change could topple the whole thing. Zihan points to several examples throughout Russian history, noting that the year before every coup or revolution the country has seen provided little cause for alarm for those in charge. But there was always a trigger event. The loss of the Crimean War damaged the Tsars, for instance. Their system collapsed following the loss in the October Revolution, according to Zihan. The Cuban Missile Crisis offers another example. It precipitated the fall of Nikita Khrushchev. In other words, a Russian realization that it has lost, and lost big, is often a trigger for a complete change in the country's leadership. The people stop buying into the propaganda, and the strongman at the top weakens to the point that he falls. That major loss hasn't come for Russia in the Ukraine war, says Zihan. However, there are signs that Putin is starting to lose the propaganda battle. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs highlighted this in May 2024, when a survey it conducted found that 72% of young adult Russians don't trust any media outlet in the country to publish unbiased and factual information. Even more worrying for Putin, 24% of those younger Russians are more likely to trust the information they get from social media, almost matching the 25% who say they trust state-owned newspapers. The message here is that many younger Russians are veering away from relying on state-owned news sources, another massive chip taken away from Putin's strongman image. The potential fall of Crimea is the only thing on the short-term horizon that could serve as the one big event that topples Putin. But even that might not be enough, at least when taken alone. Zihan posts a worrying potential example of what he means, noting that Ukraine may be able to advance to the Crimean coast. Doing that while cutting off all means of supply to the region by taking out rail lines and the bridges between Crimea and the Ukrainian mainland could allow Ukraine to turn Crimea into what Zihan dubs a death camp. The camp would be run by Russian leadership already stationed in Crimea, Zihan claims, and would see Russian people living in Crimea start to starve and die. Zihan notes that Russia already destroyed the Kakhovka Dam, meaning there's no more irrigation in Crimea for agriculture. Its food is imported, which means Ukraine blockading Crimea from the coast and destroying its logistical systems would be devastating, making the rest of the world, including Russia, aware that Russians are dying in the streets of Crimea, which is under Russian rule, could be more effective than taking the territory back. It could also be a big enough incident to finally topple Putin as the strongman leader. Speaking of people dying, the conversation later turns to the sheer scale of deaths Russia has experienced during the Ukraine war. Times Radio notes the number of Russians who died in the 10-month battle for Bakhmut equal the number of soldiers who died during the 10-year Afghan war. Worse yet for Russia, the total number of Russian deaths reached 545,090 on July 2, 2024, according to the official website of Ukraine. Putin has been sending his soldiers into a meat grinder. This isn't a new situation for Russia, Zihan argues, as the human wave approach has been used by the country multiple times over the centuries. The problem for Putin comes in the availability of manpower. Zihan claims that Russia had around 8 million men in their 20s when the war started. They've lost 500,000 of those men on the battlefield, he says, with up to 1 million more having fled the country. The fleeing figures are backed by Al Jazeera, which reported that up to 1 million Russians had left their home country as of January 2024. That leaves Russia with 6.5 million bodies to throw at the Ukrainian problem. And as Zihan points out, Russia hasn't fully mobilized yet. Its draft system has targeted the ethnically and economically disadvantaged thus far, says Zihan, and we haven't really seen what the core of the country can offer in terms of sheer manpower. That should be good news for Putin in terms of maintaining his power base, were it not for a major problem. Zihan believes the Ukraine war could rage for another 8 years. Though that does sound like a long time, Zihan says to keep two things in mind. First, Russia always does long wars. It does short intimidations, he says, but Russia typically gets dragged into drawn-out conflicts that it wins simply by having more people to throw at the war. But the human wave approach creates a major challenge for Putin, bringing us to the second thing Zihan says to consider. If Russia continues with its human wave strategy and gets dragged into an 8-year war, there won't be enough Russians under age 20 left to repopulate the country once the war ends. Russia's declining population has been a key social issue in the country for several decades. In 1993, its population reached a peak of 149 million, according to the Bank of Finland Institute for Emerging Economies, or BOFIT. At the end of 2023, it stood at 146.2 million, though that falls to 144 million if you subtract those living in Crimea. Regardless, BOFIT notes that Russia's population has either been flat or has declined every year since 2000. In 2023, just 1.27 million babies were born in the country, which is the lowest birth rate for over 20 years. More worrying for Russia is that there's also been a steep decline in the number of people aged between 25 and 30 living in the country. That figure is now 5 million fewer than it was in 2013. BOFIT also notes that Russia's current population figures are being buoyed by immigration. Take that migration away, along with removing populations from Russia's occupied territories, and its population would have shrunk by about 12 million people since 2000. So Russia already has a birth rate problem. The problem will only be exacerbated if the Ukraine war drags on for as long as Zihan predicts, as an even longer war forces Russia to mobilize further. That means more young people entering the meat grinder and being killed as a result, leading to even fewer people left in Russia to have children. Zihan's opinion: when this is done, one way or another, Russia is done. Perhaps his realization of this is why Putin is recruiting so many soldiers from abroad. The Radio Times interviewer notes the June 2024 arrest of a pair of Sri Lankan generals who were accused of aiding Russia in its war. Since that arrest, several outlets have suggested those generals, and others like them, have been duped into fighting the war. They don't want to be there. They didn't realize they would be fighting in Ukraine. Still, Putin wouldn't care either way. He simply gets more men to add to his human wave approach. Zihan notes that this appears to be part of Russia's strategy. That doesn't surprise me at all. There are Nigerians fighting in Ukraine. There are foreign exchange students that the Russians have press-ganged into fighting in Ukraine. So this is not a new strategy for the Russians. He notes that Russia used this strategy extensively during the Cold War too, leading to Russia forming strange press-ganged brigades of foreign soldiers that it doesn't advertise. Perhaps Putin's use of it now is both a recognition of the difficult situation Russia finds itself in when it comes to its population, as well as a sign of desperation. Get anybody it can into the meat grinder to try and wear Ukraine down. So where does all of this leave Putin? He faces a war that could be drawn out for many years, which could potentially result in the loss of millions more Russians. The younger population would bear the brunt of these losses, not only feeding into Russia's current population challenges, but also presenting labor issues once the war concludes. Putin also faces a resurgent Ukraine that's able to establish pockets of air superiority while using weapons supplied by its Western allies to strike Russia in its own territory. Speaking of the West, it's collectively becoming more confident in crossing Russia's red lines, with the rhetoric from NATO suggesting that it's preparing for an upcoming war with Russia. Putin is trying to balance an extremely delicate situation. If Zihan is correct, Russia's missteps in the war, combined with existing societal issues, are chipping away at the strongman image that has been so essential to his leadership. With that image weakened, it may only take one major event, such as the starving out of Crimea or the loss of the war entirely, to finally put an end to Putin's time as Russia's president. But what do you think? Is there any chance that Putin may lose his seat of power before the Ukraine war ends, or is his position stronger than Zihan suggests? Putin's burgeoning Russian empire is collapsing from the inside. To the man who has seemingly made it his life's work to turn Russia into what it used to be, this is a horror story. For more than a decade, he's been trying to claim land for his beloved Russia. The 2008 invasion of Georgia set alarm bells ringing. He followed that up with the 2014 annexation of Crimea, and in February 2022, he launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine that continues to this day. He did it all, in part, to reclaim territory that he believes Russia should rightfully own. But all he's achieved is laying the foundation for the collapse of Russia as we know it, as he has left his country on the brink of civil war. Putin's citizens are turning against him. His position as the strongman of Russian politics is in serious jeopardy. And the worst thing about all of this for Putin, we've seen it all happen before. The collapse of an empire requires a catalyst. That catalyst came on August 6, 2024, when Ukraine did something nobody believed it would ever do: invade the Kursk Oblast. Interestingly, the first news about the Kursk invasion didn't come from Ukraine. It made no grand proclamations of its intention to take Russian territory. Rather, they came from Russia, with the country's defense ministry announcing that a group of 300 Ukrainian soldiers had crossed the border into Kursk at 8 a.m. on August 6th. Those soldiers apparently wore blue tape around their arms, making them distinguishable from their enemies, and were accompanied by a small number of tanks and armored vehicles. The initial attack focused on checkpoints across the border, where the few dozen Russian border guards, many of whom were young conscripts with little experience of actual war, were quick to surrender to the invading Ukrainians. At the time, Russia claimed to have repelled the attack. The truth would turn out to be the exact opposite. Within a day of the invasion starting, Ukrainian armored vehicles were seen racing toward the town of Sudza, which is just 6 miles behind the front lines. By the third day, Ukraine's soldiers had reached Kurovino, a small village 13 miles inside the border. More gains followed. Ukraine kept advancing, taking villages along the way. 10 days into the invasion, Ukraine had taken Sudza, establishing it as a command center from which to coordinate future attacks. This prompted Putin to promise that he would deliver a worthy response to the invasion. That response is yet to come. Instead, this initial week and a half of the Kursk invasion saw Russia being forced to evacuate around 200,000 civilians from the region, while Putin was left scrambling to pull some of the 500,000 troops he had stationed in Ukraine to mount a proper defense against them. Fast forward to the end of August, the time of writing the script for this video, and Ukraine now claims to control almost 500 square miles of Russian territory within the Kursk region. That's according to its main military commander, General Alexander Syrsky, who also adds that Ukraine has captured 594 Russian prisoners so far as part of the operation. For context, the amount of seized territory is roughly the same size as Los Angeles, according to the LA Times. Further reports, this time from the BBC, claim that Ukraine now controls about 100 Russian settlements within those 500 square miles, each of which can now be fortified against the likely Russian counterattack. The entire invasion has been an enormous humiliation for Putin. For the entire war, he set himself up as the strongman of Russia, a role that many a Russian leader before him has attempted to play: authoritative, decisive, strong enough to do what needs to be done. This was the image Putin hoped to cultivate, and a large part of his success in creating that image lay in his ability to portray Russia as impenetrable. The average Russian citizen wouldn't have to worry about the Ukraine war, he could argue. The entire conflict would take place in Ukraine. At no point would war come to Russia's collective doorstep. The Kursk invasion proved that to be false. And that leads us to a question. Why did Ukraine invade Kursk in the first place? It certainly doesn't intend to annex the region and claim it as part of Ukraine, as Putin did with Crimea back in 2014. Though Ukraine is pouring more and more troops into the region, with Forbes saying it has plans to send 15,000 soldiers along with a pair of air assault brigades, those soldiers aren't tasked with turning Kursk over to Ukrainian hands. The taking of territory in Kursk does not signify the start of a larger invasion that will see Putin's empire crumble as a result of him losing country to invading Ukrainians. Zelensky's intentions are a little more complex than that. One interpretation is that the Kursk invasion is supposed to act as a diversionary tactic. Ukraine hopes that forcing Russia to divert troops to Kursk will relieve pressure on the beleaguered Donbas region in Ukraine, where Putin has focused most of his attacks in 2024 and where Russia is slowly gaining territory. In particular, Zelensky may have hoped to draw Russian soldiers away from Pokrovsk, which Forbes claims is one of Putin's main objectives in his eastern offensive in Ukraine. If that was the intention, the invasion may have failed in its diversionary goal. On August 28, Forbes reported that Russia had taken the Ukrainian village of Novorodivka, which lies just 5 miles outside of Pokrovsk. Putin is likely setting up for a renewed offensive, and Ukraine's commitment of troops to Kursk could mean that it's less able to mount a sturdy defense in response. Other motives put forward by Harvard University Ukrainian Research Institution fellow Paul Danieri seem to make more sense. Speaking to the University of California, Riverside, he points out that it's not clear exactly how the Kursk invasion will affect the key battles being fought in the Ukraine war. However, it serves other purposes. The invasion's initial success, he says, is clearly a big morale booster for Ukrainians and a political problem for Putin and his military leaders. The latter issue is extremely important in terms of why Kursk could prove to be the catalyst for the collapse of modern Russia. As Danieri points out, Putin took the rare step of appearing on Russian television to dress down his military leaders in front of the entire nation. His intention was clear: continue to project the strongman image that served him so well as Russian leader. The problem lies in what the Kursk invasion has managed to achieve: the shattering of Russia's aura of invincibility. Putin's dressing down of his military leaders took place while Ukraine was taking more territory and thousands of Russians were being evacuated. Putin could no longer hold himself up as the man to protect Russia. Dressing down his military leaders in public may also prove to be a mistake. After all, it raises questions as to why those leaders were appointed in the first place, if they were incompetent enough to allow a Ukrainian invasion. The Russian people may not be able to question Putin publicly, but privately, many are likely starting to doubt the decision-making capabilities of their leader. Therein we find what may be the true motive for the Kursk invasion. Zelensky likely knows that Ukraine can't hold Kursk forever. Russia will launch a counter-offensive at some point. Deputy CIA Director David Cohen says this is practically an inevitability, saying on August 28th, "We can be certain that Putin will mount a counter-offensive to try to reclaim that territory." He notes that it will be a difficult fight for Russia, especially as Putin's slow response has afforded Ukraine time to build defensive lines, but the counterattack is coming. Unfortunately for Putin, the response may be too little too late. Ukraine has already achieved one of its primary goals of rattling Russia's faith in its militaristic leader. The strongman image is shattered, not only for the Russian military as a whole, but also for the man who leads it. And if everything goes according to plan for Ukraine, the Kursk invasion will serve as both the turning point for the Ukraine war and the beginning of the end for Putin. Of course, that brings us to an obvious question: how? How could the Kursk invasion trigger a civil war in Russia, or at the very least, lead to the burgeoning empire Putin is trying to build collapsing? The answer starts with something to which we've already alluded. The Kursk invasion showcases Putin's military miscalculations. This starts with his failure to reinforce Russia's northern borders with Ukraine, as Putin has poured all of his efforts into the eastern offensive during 2024. That led to the situation we saw on August 6th, when Ukraine's forces were able to easily overcome Russia's border checkpoints. Putin has assigned recent Russian conscript to those checkpoints, none of whom had the experience or ability to fight back against the incoming Ukrainian forces. Worse yet, as retired Russian General Andrei Gurylev, who is a member of the lower house of Russia's parliament, points out, those border soldiers had no intelligence. Regrettably, the group of forces protecting the border didn't have its own intelligence assets, he claimed on the Telegram messaging app. No one likes to see the truth in reports. Everybody just wants to hear that all is good. The truth in reports. Those 4 words are a reflection of the fact that many in Russia, including some in its own political circles, recognize that the information they get from state-owned media outlets is tailored to keep Putin in power. Russia's leader isn't telling his people the truth about what's happening in Kursk, but his attempts to pull the wool over their eyes are failing. After all, they can see the evidence with their own eyes. Russia has lost territory, and the people of Kursk are being evacuated. All of this can be traced back to Putin's military mistakes, both in terms of failing to secure the Kursk border and not providing his troops with the intelligence they needed. Putin made another mistake. He underestimated General Alexander Syrsky. Now Ukraine's top military officer, Syrsky commanded Ukraine's forces in Kharkiv in 2022, leading the country to a victory over the invading Russian forces that played a key role in Russia's failure to secure Kyiv in the early weeks of the war. Syrsky is a man who had the call sign Snow Leopard, and he's also the man who took over from General Valery Zaluzhny after Zelensky ousted his former military leader in early 2024. Putin's mistake lay in assuming that Syrsky would take the same approach as his predecessor when it comes to launching attacks against Russian forces. In 2023, Zaluzhny was the man responsible for organizing a Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russia. That counteroffensive failed, not least because it was so highly publicized that Russia had plenty of time to set up defenses that enabled them to hold the territory Ukraine hoped to retake. Putin got to look like a military genius in front of his people, the man who organized Russia's military to hold off the biggest offensive Ukraine was capable of mustering. But the reality was that Putin's success only came because of Zaluzhny's failings, with Syrsky being a far different beast. Ukraine's new military leader is described as an obsessive planner with iron discipline by Sky News, with Al Jazeera noting that some in Ukraine call him the Butcher. He also favors quiet and precise strikes against his enemies over full-blown and well-publicized offensives. We saw this in his approach to taking on a Putin-backed insurgency in eastern Ukraine back in 2014, during which the Russian security official Dmitry Medvedev described him using tactics that were similar to how this cat hunts, in reference to his snow leopard call sign. So the warning signs were there. Any attack arranged by Syrsky would be extremely well organized and would not involve an all-out offensive at which body after body is thrown. The strikes would be small, precise, scattered. In other words, exactly what we've seen in Kursk, as Ukraine's forces conduct tactical strikes against their Russian opposition by using smaller groups. Putin should have known all of this about Syrsky. He'd seen plenty of Syrsky's approach on the battlefield, yet he underestimated the Ukrainian military leader and by extension, underestimated Ukraine's ability to take Russian territory. Here we start to see some parallels between Putin and his Soviet-era predecessors. After all, Russia has a history of underestimating its opponents. In the 1980s, Russia entered Afghanistan, believing that it would be able to quickly destroy the rebels in that country and subjugate it under Soviet rule. The Soviet Union failed. It wound up stuck in a quagmire of a war that lasted for almost a decade and led to the deaths of 15,000 Soviet soldiers. Russia was forced to withdraw. Bruce Riedel, who worked on the CIA's plan to aid the Afghan rebels at the time, points out that Putin seems to have underestimated the Ukrainians today, in the same way that the Soviet Union underestimated Afghanistan. Milton Bearden, another CIA operative during the Afghanistan war, puts it more pointedly. In setting out to reverse history, Putin may instead be repeating it. Patterns are starting to repeat. The Ukraine war, which was meant to be over in a matter of weeks, has descended into a quagmire similar to that seen in Afghanistan in the 80s. Only this time it's a quagmire that's costing far more Russian lives, 612,390, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance and various other outlets. The Washington Post says that Russia's war in Afghanistan led to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin's underestimation of his Ukrainian enemy may be taking him and today's Russia down the very same path. Underestimating his enemy isn't the only way that Putin has undermined his own position. The Kursk invasion is just one of several examples during his reign in which he's failed to protect the Russian people. The Conversation published a piece covering this toward the end of August 2024, noting that Kursk is just the latest puncture hole in Putin's image of protector in a long line. It points out that the Ukraine war has seen multiple Russian towns and cities, including Moscow, be subjected to drone attacks by Ukraine. It also draws parallels between the Kursk invasion and another famous Kursk incident, the sinking of the nuclear submarine that bore the oblast's name. On August 12, 2000, around 3 months after Putin first became Russia's president, the Kursk submarine experienced an explosion in one of its torpedo hatches. Most of the submarine's 118-member crew died, though 23 survivors managed to barricade themselves in a compartment of the submarine where they awaited rescue. Here was an opportunity for Putin to solidify his reputation as a protector of the Russian people. Instead, he delayed. Putin refused foreign help for fear that doing so would make him look weak. When Norwegian divers were eventually allowed down into the submarine on August 21st, the 23 survivors of the blast were dead. Putin refused to talk about the incident, going so far as to not even cancel a vacation he was taking in Sochi when the crisis occurred. A pattern of behavior had been set. On September 1, 2004, a group of 30 armed militants stormed a school in the Russian city of Beslan, taking 1,000 hostages that included children, family members, and teachers. Putin acted a little quicker this time. He ordered special forces to enter the building on September 3rd. A bloodbath ensued. The chaotic battle led to hundreds of the hostages being killed, including 186 children. Both survivors and relatives of those killed sued the Russian government via the European Court of Human Rights, alleging that Putin had mishandled the entire situation. They won. The court ruled that Russia's government had failed to protect the hostages. What does all of this mean? More patterns are emerging. Not only does Putin regularly underestimate the situations he faces, but he often makes the wrong decisions. These decisions have an impact on the Russian people, whether those be the 23 who die in the submarine because he delays, or hundreds dying in a school because he bungles. His mismanagement of the Kursk invasion is yet another example of Putin's failure to protect his people, and it may be the final straw. Again, we see parallels with the Soviet Union, in the sense that as powerful as a leader may be, it's the people who ultimately control the fate of their countries. The fall of the Soviet Union was precipitated by mass protests, such as the April 1991 protest in Minsk's Lenin Square and the August 1989 protest featuring 2 million people in the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The people were making their unhappiness with the current regime known. Putin's failure to protect his people, a pattern that he has displayed throughout his leadership, could lead to similar situations in today's Russia. After all, he's already having to deal with fury amongst those people. On August 17, 2024, The Guardian published a piece in which it spoke to a Russian woman named Lyubov Antipova. The daughter of elderly parents who lived in Zalshenka, a village in the Kursk region. She claims that she implored her parents to leave their village when she first started hearing rumors about an invasion. Antipova's parents didn't listen. Why would they? Putin was in charge and they hadn't seen any sort of invasion since World War II. Then the photographs started filtering through. One showed Ukrainian troops standing outside a supermarket near the office of a gas company. Antipova knew the location well. It was only around 150 feet from her parents' home. "We were sure the Russian army would protect us," Antipova says. "I'm amazed how quickly the Ukrainian forces advanced." Others in Kursk were similarly caught off guard by the invasion. Alexander Zorin, who is the curator of the city's archaeology museum, says that the reports being given to him were inaccurate. Officials' reports were not scary at all. 100 saboteurs went in, he says. But then it went up to 300, 800. It was impossible to get a clear picture. Zorin would wind up being one of the 200,000 people who have since been evacuated from Kursk. Other Russian citizens have expressed anger about Putin's response to the Kursk invasion. Speaking to CBC, a Ukrainian soldier who wishes to be identified by the tagline "Wolverine" said that many of the citizens he encountered have expressed anger at the authorities. They speak about betrayal from the Russian government. They did not declare evacuation and immediately turned off water and light, so they created unbearable living conditions, he claimed. He also provided CBC with a short, albeit edited video that showed a Russian man complaining about feeling abandoned by Russian authorities. Of course, none of these people mentioned Putin by name. To do so would be to invite repercussions, but the message is clear. Putin is the head of Russia and the man who put these authorities in place. Once again, he had failed to protect his people. What's more, that lack of protection was accompanied by a constant campaign of disinformation. Again, much as was seen throughout the entirety of the Soviet Union's existence, that led many in Kursk to fail to protect themselves because they didn't understand the sheer scale of what was coming. Putin is on the verge of losing the support of his people. And that's not his only problem when it comes to his own people. A strongman politician like Putin relies on support from his country's elite. It's a you scratch our back and we'll scratch yours situation, in which the elite use their influence to prop up the leader as long as they feel they're getting something in return. Those elites may also be starting to turn against Putin. After all, many have been affected by the Western sanctions that have been put in place since the beginning of the war. Oligarchs and officials close to Putin have also felt the sting of the West freezing their assets. In addition to the $300 billion in Russian central bank assets that the West has frozen and are now being used to fund Ukraine, another $30 billion in assets owned by officials and oligarchs are also immobilized. Russia's elites, though they'll never see the war up close, are feeling its pinch in their pockets. Many have been oddly silent about the war, with few coming out to express full support for Putin. A handful even believe that Russia could lose. In June 2023, Pravda published a report citing a Bloomberg article from the same month, stating that some of Russia's elite are experiencing a deepening gloom. Even the most optimistic among them believe that the best outcome possible now is a frozen conflict in which both countries declare ceasefires without actively ending the war. The piece also quotes Kirill Rogov, a former advisor to Putin who left Russia after the invasion began. They're afraid to become scapegoats for a meaningless war, he says. It's really surprising how widespread among the Russian elite became the idea of a chance Putin won't win this war. Bear in mind these comments came in June 2023, over a year later, and those elites are watching as Putin has failed to repel an invasion into Russian territory. Where does all of this leave Putin when it comes to his people? It would be inaccurate to claim that the general citizens are calling for the Russian leader's head. They aren't, and any who would like to would be restricted from doing so by Putin's policies anyway. But there's a clear feeling of discontent. The people of Kursk are angry, and not only with the misinformation Putin has spread, but his lack of proper response to the invasion that once again showcases his pattern of failing to take decisive action in service of his people. Putin also appears to be losing the support of some of Russia's elite, with discontent growing and an ever-increasing feeling that Russia isn't going to win the Ukraine war looming over that segment of the population. In short, Putin is losing the support of his people. And as Russia's own history has shown time and again, even an authoritarian strongman leader is at risk of seeing their empire crumble once the people turn against them. The Kursk invasion may prove to be the catalyst for rebellion against Putin, but could such a rebellion lead to civil war? While that may seem like an impossibility on the surface, it's worth remembering that Russia came very close to experiencing a civil war in June 2023. That's when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former leader of the Wagner private military group, essentially declared an insurrection against Putin and Russia's military leaders. Wagner had already played a key role in the Ukraine war, with the brutal group having been involved almost from the beginning. German intelligence claims that Wagner soldiers were involved in the massacre of Ukrainian civilians in the Ukrainian town of Bucha in March 2022, with Ukraine also claiming that a trio of Wagner mercenaries were responsible for capturing, torturing, and killing Ukrainian civilians near Kyiv a month later. By June 2023, Wagner had grown dissatisfied with how Putin was leading the war, resulting in the force, under Prigozhin's leadership, advancing through the city of Rostov-on-Don to surround Russia's southern military headquarters. The coup ended quickly, with Prigozhin reversing his decision very soon after. Still, it showcases just how tenuous Putin's hold on power may be. If a group like Wagner is able to gain support from Russia's rank-and-file military, according to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, such insurrections would grow larger and far more significant. If those rebels gain the support of the Russian people, whose collective confidence in Putin as a protector and strongman has already been shaken, the potential for a civil war that leads to Putin being ousted will only grow. Add to all of this that Putin is making many of the same mistakes made by the Soviet leaders who came before him. We see this in the repeated nuclear threats toward both Ukraine and nations that have supported it during the war. Such threats of nuclear war were constant during the Cold War, though no Soviet leader ever followed up on them. Putin is doing the same thing, threatening nukes without deploying them. Not only do these empty threats reinforce Ukraine's confidence when crossing red lines in the war, but they once again showcase Putin as a man who doesn't back up his words to the Russian people. But perhaps most damaging to Putin is the potential for his people to start seeing him as a mirror image of Joseph Stalin. According to the Hoover Institute, Putin mirrors Stalin in many ways. While he may not have swept up millions in purges, Putin has never shied away from getting rid of his enemies. We need only look at Yevgeny Prigozhin for evidence of that. The former Wagner leader died in August 2023 when his business jet crashed over the Tver Oblast. The likely cause of that explosion was a bomb placed on the plane by a Putin-aligned saboteur. Putin also mirrors Stalin in other ways. Both are militaristic leaders, even if Putin doesn't wear his uniform as Stalin did, and both relied on projecting powerful images to remain in control. Both also routinely replace the people around them, with a specific focus on military generals who failed to achieve the outcomes they'd hoped to. Hoover also points out that the two share motifs in their propaganda, with each calling for sacrifices in service of the motherland, with those sacrifices coming in the form of the blood of their people. You could even argue that Putin displays a callous disregard for the Russian people, as seen in the Kursk submarine incident and the bungled approach to the Beslan hostage crisis. Each are echoes of Stalin's willingness to kill his own to maintain his power base. Parallels among parallels, not just in personality but in approach. Ultimately, it's those parallels that may spell the end for Putin and cause his Russian empire to crumble. He's failed to learn from the mistakes of his country's past. It's Putin's underestimation of his enemies and overestimation of himself that allowed the Kursk invasion to happen. As a result of that invasion, discontent is growing among his people, with that discontent only adding to that felt by many of the Russian elite. Putin has already had to fight off one insurrection during the war, and there's a good chance more will come as his people grow increasingly disaffected. Vladimir Putin is on shaky ground. Ground that's so shaky that it may be his own people who defeat him before Ukraine does, which might come as early as 2025 if some strategists are correct, but more on that in some of our other videos. But what do you think? Does Putin stand on the precipice of losing his power, or will he find some way to recover his strongman image? 2.5 years into one of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century, Russia teeters on the brink of an economic abyss. The cause? A silent, insidious disease, one that could cripple the nation's future. Not COVID-19, though that too has taken its toll. This is a different kind of disease, one that thrives not in the body, but in the very fabric of Russia's society and economy. It's a disease that's brought down empires before, and now it's festering within Russia's energy-rich veins. This isn't a virus, but its effects are no less devastating. This is the Dutch disease, an economic curse that's resurfaced time and again, pulling nations from power to peril. Russia, it seems, has caught this disease through its vast energy reserves. But how deep does the infection run? How rapidly is it spreading? And could it spell the end for Putin's reign? Let's unravel the mystery. Russia is one of the world's largest suppliers of natural gas and crude oil. However, the country has almost completely realigned its main economic sectors, energy manufacturing and service, towards catering for the needs of extracting and exporting non-renewable energy resources. Sure, this has allowed Russia to start the war relatively unimpeded, allowing it to fuel its war machine with billions of dollars of investments that were diverted from energy exports. However, this reliance on the energy sector as a whole can have widespread consequences that stack one upon another until they bring the country to the brink of collapse. This might finally be enough to remove the ruling class from the head of state and create a revolution in Russia. Let's start with some numbers. Russia has arguably been one of the countries that's bounced back from the effects of COVID-19 fastest, managing to grow its economy while the West stagnated. Even now, in 2024, the Russian economy is growing at a pace of 2.6%, which is more than a full percentage point than the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, predicted at the end of October 2023. Compare this to the economic growth of the EU, Russia's closest ideological and military opponent, which is slated to be only 1%. The figures are starting to paint a slightly dim picture of how the West is doing compared to what is effectively a war economy. But that's not exactly the full story. While the Russian budget is indeed increasing year after year, nearly 40% of the 2024 budget is expected to be spent on military and national defense. This translates to roughly 6% of the country's GDP, a figure unheard of in Western countries. For comparison, the US is projecting that its national defense budget is only 3% of its GDP, while most of Europe is peddling figures around 2.1%. Of course, it pays to take into account that the US total GDP is still magnitudes larger than that of Russia, but the precedent is undeniable. Russia's economy is growing on paper, but the country is wrapping up that growth into its war machine instead of sectors that are more important in the long term: manufacturing, service, and infrastructure. Additionally, the country is pretty much all in on its reliance on trade. Roughly 30% of the country's GDP comes from exports, compared to only 12.5% for the US. As a result, Russia has become increasingly dependent on trade, but those trading partners might not remain partners for long. This falls back to the aforementioned reliance on energy export. Between 2022 and 24, Russian revenue from fuel exports dropped from around $1.360 million in US dollars to $820 million per day, a nearly 40% decrease. This includes the fact that the country is currently on a slight upswing due to increased exports to India and China, arguably two of the largest resource trading partners. The lowest point in the fuel revenue in recent years was in July 2023 at around $680 million per day, roughly half of the revenue at the start of the invasion. This means that the Russian economy, which is already extremely dependent on exporting stuff out of the country, has been exporting fewer energy products for the past few years. Which brings us back to the crux of the issue and the main forecast behind the country's potential collapse: the Dutch disease. Coined in 1977, the Dutch disease is a years-long process where the country's economy suffers due to an unexpected windfall in a specific sector, primarily in natural resources. The disease was named after the Dutch discovered the Groningen natural gas field in 1959. This led to the country's energy sector booming, seemingly with no downsides at first, and the economy received a solid boon over the next few years. This sounds great for the Dutch, right? Wrong. As the energy sector grew, the manpower required to sustain it didn't. The growing demand for workers shifted the availability of manpower from other fields, particularly industry and manufacturing, to employ more people in the energy sector. Economists observed that the manufacturing sector fell rapidly, which caused rapid political discontent in its wake. In general, however, the symptoms of the Dutch disease can vary between one country or economy and the next. The main principles are that a country has at least 3 overlapping sectors, one of which is non-tradable, typically the service sector which supports the internal population, while the others are such as manufacturing, energy, or agriculture. The first symptom of the disease is that one of the tradable sectors experiences a sudden boom. In the case of the Netherlands and Russia, this is the energy sector and is referred to as the resource movement effect. Much like the Dutch discovered a significant deposit of natural resources, Russia has already been working on expanding its energy exports for decades. This has only been exacerbated as Russia has been on the receiving end of more and more embargoes from Western countries. However, the other tradable sectors typically can't compete with this growth. As the booming sector starts requiring more people and investments to maintain this growth, it begins eating away at others, with people transferring sectors for better salaries and more lucrative returns. Effectively, this leads to reducing the level of industrialization, agricultural self-sufficiency, or internal manufacturing. Of course, the energy sector has comparatively few manpower demands compared to manufacturing. The actual or direct deindustrialization can be negligible for most countries affected by the disease, including the Netherlands in the 60s and Russia today. What follows, however, is that the people who were already employed in the energy sector and the few converts from the industry field suddenly have a lot more capital at their disposal. Apart from binding this in investments, the improved spending capability encourages growth in the non-tradable sectors, as the economic processes encourage the newly gained money to be circulated through the population. This leads to increased demands and earnings in the service sectors. Now, this can have a much more significant effect on the manpower availability between the various sectors. Since people generally won't be leaving the booming sector, the growth of the service sector puts even more strain on manufacturing or agriculture as the population shifts from producing products to offering services. This spending effect creates indirect deindustrialization. The same process is currently being applied to Russia, but is exacerbated by the country's ongoing conflict and investment in national defense. Furthermore, as the country's population turns more towards a single tradable sector and a non-tradable one, the country's currency exchange rate might fluctuate. In Russia's case, for example, foreign energy buyers need to transact in rubles and the services are typically paid for in rubles, requiring foreign investors to exchange their currency for rubles. However, this fluctuation in exchange rates can make it more worthwhile for end users to purchase manufactured products from abroad. This creates even more pressure on the non-booming sectors, plunging the country further into reliance on the single booming sector and services to keep the budget afloat. This can be summarized by the volatile ruble exchange rate over the past few years. If we take a look at the 5-year US dollar to ruble exchange rate, the month after the invasion saw the rate skyrocket by nearly 70% to over 120%. A few months later, in March 2022, the rate plunged into a 9-year low, $1 equaling 50 rubles. Based on previous trends, the ruble exchange rate has a bit of a correlation to the price of crude oil and gas. To Russia's credit, the country's government has taken significant steps to reduce the connection between the ruble and fuel prices, with several policies to reduce foreign spending and tie the price of the ruble to the country's gold reserves. But how exactly can a country die from the Dutch disease? Well, while Russia has done as much as possible to disentangle the price of the ruble from the price of natural gas and crude oil, it's still highly dependent on exporting those resources to other countries. As such, the booming energy sector is highly volatile to external changes in the global market. For the simplest example, other oil and gas producing countries such as Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the US or Canada also have significant oil and gas reserves and comparable abilities to export these resources across the world. While Russia arguably has the biggest oil export surplus, the difference between exports and imports, this position can easily be overturned by Saudi Arabia or even the US due to the increasing industrialization and utilization of oil fields in Texas. In a hypothetical situation, Saudi Arabia or the US could start pumping out more oil and gas from their fields and exporting them to countries that Russia traditionally trades with. This could lead to a drop in fossil fuel prices, which could cause Russia's energy sector to lower its investment interests and cease being the booming sector. If that happens and the oil and gas magnates can no longer prop up the sector with their wealth, this deficit will trickle down to the service sector. Without the funding provided by the booming sector, the service sector would become another strain on the country's economy. This will be made worse by the fact that the country has been deindustrialized, with a lack of domestic agriculture and manufacturing capability. For a country with the Dutch disease, the booming sector effectively becomes the lifeline that's keeping the economy afloat. If the sector stops generating revenue, the other sectors will fall around it like a house of cards. This brings about the polarity between Russia's natural resources and its ability to utilize them as a driver behind the country's economy. As mentioned, the country is significantly more dependent on oil and gas exports to power its budget compared to other world economies such as the US, EU, and China. On the other hand, the country's hostile takeovers of various former Soviet territories in the previous decades have severely deteriorated foreign relations with most of the Western world. This has led to a slew of economic sanctions, starting with the 2014 annexation of Crimea and peaking with the full-blown invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Right now, the country is practically barred from trading in US dollars, relying on ruble and yuan trading for the bulk of its import and export needs. Additionally, the sanctions have also led to a centralization of the country's export efforts. This is perhaps most notable in the energy sector. While Russia's oil exports haven't declined noticeably since the start of the 2022 invasion, the range of countries to which Russia exports has been reduced significantly. For example, while the EU was one of the biggest importers of Russian oil and gas, the current trade is less than 20% of pre-invasion numbers. Additionally, Russian exports to the UK and the US, while not particularly significant compared to the bulk of others, have stopped completely. Conversely, China, India, and to a lesser extent Turkey currently account for more than 65% of Russia's oil exports. This puts Russia in somewhat of a bind, as the countries have the ability to negotiate the prices of Russian resources, allowing them to get lower prices than anywhere else in the world. As an example, the 2023 deal between China and Russia allowed China to get Russian natural gas at nearly half the price than usual. This cements the stranglehold that the global economy is slowly putting on Russia, worsening the potential debilitating consequences of the Dutch disease. Of course, the second symptom of Russia's Dutch disease has been starting to show, particularly in regard to the near monopolization of imported manufactured products. The current trade between China and Russia is yet another such example. China currently accounts for roughly 30% of Russian imports and 38% of exports. In particular, the car market in Russia is represented by around 60% of Chinese vehicles, compared to the measly 9% in February 2022, just before the invasion. A similar concept applies to tractor imports, which are vital for the country's agriculture. As another non-booming sector, Russia's agriculture could take a significant hit if the manufactured products required to keep the industry running are imported from abroad. This ties into the indirect deindustrialization mentioned as one of the symptoms of the disease. But how susceptible is the country to the Dutch disease? As mentioned, the country's GDP growth has arguably stabilized and even exceeded the IMF's expectations. While the country's manufacturing sector has arguably taken a hit, per the Dutch disease hypothesis, the country's weapons and munitions manufacturing increased significantly. For example, Russia has produced more than 67% more ships and aircraft and 46% more non-car motor vehicles throughout 2023 than in the previous year. However, it's not certain whether Russia can actually sustain these efforts for long, as the Western sanctions have also prevented Russia from accessing the newest technologies in the sectors. As a result, Russia can only eventually produce quantity rather than quality, which might not directly correlate to long-term economic growth and prosperity. Sure, China's industrialization in the 20th century led to it becoming one of the biggest economies in the world, but this upheaval is highly unlikely for a country that is already relatively industrialized and disconnected from the Western world. One of the biggest long-term problems that Russia faces in the coming years is its short-term infusion towards military and national defense spending. We already mentioned that roughly 30 to 40% of the government's 2024 budget was allocated to these sectors. This comes at the expense of all others. While the energy sector is relatively safe from downturns due to the sheer availability of resources and interdependence with the Russian economies, others are not likely to fare as well. For example, over 100,000 of the country's IT specialists have emigrated in 2022 alone, and seemingly might not have any plans to return. The total number of emigrants is estimated to be over 800,000, which is also likely to put even more strain on the country's economy in both the short and long term. Not only is this a blow to the country's service sector, but it also reduces the potential manpower Russia can enlist in its war effort against Ukraine. The construction of the national budget on non-military sectors, as well as the country's declining educated population, will likely correlate with a lowered quality of life throughout Russia in the coming years. While it's possible that Russia can reverse course on some of the policies that try to spark a bit of life in the industrial sector, its current focus on powering the war machine and supporting the energy industry makes this prospect unlikely. As a result, Russia is slowly choked by its over-reliance on war and energy exports to support its government and economy. We have to remember that Russia is currently heavily dependent on China for imports and exports. Additionally, the countries have seemingly aligned foreign policies. While this would mean that ideally, Russia could prosper from being under China's wing, this might not be entirely true. You see, China might not be all in on supporting Russia's efforts and bolstering its economy. While the two countries are allies on paper, there's still a bit of bad blood between them in historical context. This is particularly important in the bordering region of Outer Manchuria, which China was forced to cede to Russia after the Opium Wars in the 19th century. The region is extremely far away from the centralized Russian government in the Kremlin. Its population is also roughly 1/20th of the Chinese population in the regions across its border. In recent months, China has started pushing to resolve the issue of Outer Manchuria, at least for the issues it perceived. For example, recent Chinese maps have relabeled Russian cities in the region with their Chinese counterparts or historical names prior to the Russian annexation. The border between Outer Manchuria and China is also composed of two vital rivers, Amur and Ussuri, which can be a significant boon to China's meager water resources. Also, the rivers allow easy access to the Sea of Japan. This would be a vital diversification in China's ability to send maritime trading routes, bypassing the contested South China Sea, which has a bottleneck in the Strait of Malacca. Furthermore, Outer Manchuria could be a staging ground for a more widespread Chinese invasion of Russia to secure better access to Siberian resources. Siberia is particularly important to China due to its abundance of natural resources including drinking water, timber and minerals. All of these are something that China sorely lacks, especially in the northern population centers, which severely lack drinking water, and the booming Chinese manufacturing industries that rely on timber and iron. Siberia's relative remoteness from the Kremlin and the Russo-Ukrainian front means that Russia doesn't exert nearly as much control over the area, leaving it potentially open to Chinese influence. An attempt to seize the reins over the Siberian drinking water supply has been made in the 2010s, with many Chinese companies buying Russian land and attempting to create pipelines from Lake Baikal to the Chinese mainland. The lake is the largest reservoir of freshwater in the world, and the Chinese population could be supplied from it for decades. However, the local Russian government has managed to put a stop to those attempts, removing the Chinese influence in the area, at least for now. With Russia currently experiencing potential economic upheaval and focusing on war attempts in the West, the Siberian regions could be ripe for Chinese picking. Of course, China is currently being held up by the US influence, especially due to the Singaporean stranglehold of the Strait of Malacca, which is used by China's most important maritime trade routes. This puts China in a difficult position where it can't make offensive moves against Russia without the US disrupting its economy by blockading maritime trade. However, China's Belt and Road Initiative aims to reduce its dependence on maritime trade routes and connect it to countries across Asia. If China manages to relieve the pressure from the US, it could feasibly invade Russia to take its natural resources. Apart from removing a large chunk of Russian territory, it would remove the bulk of the Russian trade-based economy, quickening its collapse. But it's not only China that poses a threat to Russia's economy. India is also a significant contender, albeit more indirectly. While China is one of the US's biggest economic and ideological enemies, India has taken a different course in its foreign relations. As part of the quadrilateral security dialogue with the US, Australia, and Japan, India aims to reduce China's economic pressure in the region. As a result, India has been separating itself from China's economy and increasing its presence in the Indian Ocean, which allows it to control the Strait of Malacca indirectly. India has also started to cut itself off from the neighboring countries, which are heavily supported by China. Coupled with the support from the US, India is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Europe-India corridor. The corridor is a sequence of trading routes that go from Europe across the Mediterranean to the Middle East via rail and maritime routes across the Indian Ocean. If implemented, it would more efficiently connect the US with India. It would also allow India to reduce its resource imports from Russia. India's reluctance to work with Chinese interests means it's likely to also work against Russian interests in the long term. If Russian exports to India slow down or stop, it would mean a significant blow to the Russian economy, effectively jump-starting the collapse heralded by the Dutch disease. With all that said, is there a timeline for how long it takes for the Dutch disease to run its course and cause significant economic upheaval? Unfortunately, the answer is all but simple. The IMF has identified that Russia either caught the Dutch disease all the way back in 2007 or at least had the potential to do so. This would mean that Russia has managed to stave off the negative effects of the process for at least 15 years. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 didn't seem to yield significant adverse reactions to the Russian economy. Due to the EU's dependence on Russian oil and gas at the time, the country was relatively unaffected by major symptoms of the disease. This was thanks to the booming energy sector being allowed to continue to grow and the negative deindustrialization cancelled out by sheer economic growth and incentives. Considering the timeline between the 2007 report, it's possible that the recent years have rapidly accelerated the progress of the disease and sped up the potential for Russian economic decline. If so, there's still some uncertainty as to how much Russia's economy can withstand foreign influence from both the West and its main trading partners, China and India. With Russia getting increasingly cut off from the Western world and the hostilities between NATO and Russia increasing, it's highly likely that China will become the decisive factor. Russia's economy can collapse if China cuts off the vital trade income and/or by outright hostile action. On the other hand, China might actively prop the country's economy to the point of complete dependence, making Russia all but a puppet for the Chinese interests in Eastern Europe. The progressing symptoms of the Dutch disease might prompt China into action, and the results could be devastating. But what do you think about the effect of the Dutch disease in Russia? Is the country's economy on the brink of collapse, and will China and the US capitalize on it? In February 2022, Russia's President Vladimir Putin made a decision that shocked the global community. He invaded Ukraine. That war was meant to be a smash-and-grab operation, with Russia rolling in on tanks to secure Kyiv before establishing its rule in Ukraine as a whole. And it almost worked. Russian forces managed to enter Kyiv, albeit briefly, before resistance fighters pushed them back. Then that resistance started gathering steam. Most of the Western world supported Ukraine financially and provided military equipment, giving Kyiv the ability to fight back against Putin's aggression. To date, Western nations have pledged and provided over $380 billion in aid to Ukraine, with more on the way. This wasn't what Putin wanted. What was supposed to be an easy victory has devolved into a multi-year war that looks unlikely to end anytime soon. And yet, rather than withdrawing from Ukraine and accepting that it isn't going to achieve the easy victory it anticipated, Russia keeps pushing forward with the fight. But why? Putin's arrogance. That will be the focus of this video, as we explore how Putin's arrogance has led him into a no-win situation in Ukraine, and how, terrifyingly for the Russian public, Putin's ambition could be the death of his country. But before we dig into how Putin's arrogance will destroy Russia, we need to learn a little bit more about the man. Specifically, what drove him to invade Ukraine in the first place. Whenever he speaks publicly, Putin offers hints to one of the main reasons he invaded Ukraine. He is, if nothing else, a patriot, and he longs for the days when Russia was one of the world's most powerful countries. Putin wants to restore the glory days of the Soviet Union, ignoring all of the internal strife that period caused in his country, and wishes to restore Russia's dominance over the rest of Europe. We can see snippets of this agenda coming through in Putin's February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson. In this interview, Putin tries to position himself less as an aggressor to the Ukrainian people and more as a savior to not only the country but the rest of Europe. Specifically, he claims that the denazification of Ukraine was one of his main goals with the war, with Putin telling Carlson, "We haven't achieved our aims yet because one of them is denazification." A seemingly noble cause. However, in one of the few times when Carlson pressed an issue in that interview, Putin was later asked if he would be satisfied with the territory he has now if he wins in Ukraine. Putin didn't respond to that question, instead returning to his point of denazifying Ukraine. The takeaway? Putin wouldn't be satisfied with just claiming Ukraine. He wants to restore Russia to its former glory. Other parts of that interview deliver a more direct through-line into his thinking. At various points, Putin engages in long and rambling diatribes, which he dresses up as history lessons, talking about how Russia and Europe were in the past. Though long-winded, these discussions reveal that Putin still sees Europe in old terms, with part of his justification for invading Ukraine seemingly boiling down to it was part of Russia before, and so it should be part of Russia now. To anybody who'd been paying attention to Putin's rhetoric when the war started, this was nothing new. In February 2024, the same month Russia invaded Ukraine, The Guardian reported on an hour-long speech Putin gave, in which he delivered his version of the history of Ukraine. Notable snippets from that interview include Putin claiming, "Ukraine is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space," as well as claiming the Bolsheviks made a massive mistake when they recognized Ukraine as a republic. The claims on land kept coming, when he also discussed how ceding territory as part of ending World War I was another mistake, along with lamentations of the loss of territory of the former Russian Empire. By this point, Putin's agenda seems clear. He wants a return to the old Russia. And to some, that may not be a sign of arrogance. It's natural for a patriot to want to see his country reclaim the glory days and take its position as a leader on the global stage. However, Putin's desire to restore Russia isn't driven by his love of country. It's driven by revenge and a desire for personal power. After all, Putin's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine is far from the first time that he's tried to control the country. It's just the most direct military attempt. He's made several tries at establishing Russian dominance in Ukraine over the past 2 decades. Take Ukraine's 2004 presidential election as an example. That election saw Putin's first real attempt to create what he calls managed democracy, a term the Carnegie Endowment for Peace says Putin uses to describe the type of regime he wants to create. In short, Putin doesn't want full democracy. He wants a shadow version, in which elections are held, but they're so lopsided toward his agenda that they may as well not exist. To that end, he poured all of his efforts into helping Ukraine's then Prime Minister, Viktor Yanukovych, secure the country's presidency. He failed. Despite spending an enormous amount of money on Yanukovych's campaign, as well as attempting to hinder the rest of the world's understanding of the election result, Putin couldn't get his puppet into office. Allegations of voter fraud abounded, with outgoing President Leonid Kuchma told that he had to dismiss the Central Election Commission's chairman by Charles Tannock, the European Parliament's delegation for Ukraine. Tannock said the chairman had clearly not been above board, going on to cite figures that suggested several parts of the country had seen voter turnouts of more than 100%. He added that absentee ballot abuse, ballot stuffing, and even intimidation of voters had taken place. Putin even campaigned on behalf of his preferred candidate, only to see tens of thousands of Yanukovych's opponent supporters line the streets of Kyiv to protest the official tally that had placed Yanukovych 3 points ahead. That opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, eventually received the backing of most of the Ukrainian parliament. The country's Supreme Court ended up annulling the election result, with Yushchenko coming out on top in a fairer vote several weeks later. Putin ended up shooting himself in the foot. By so radically backing Yanukovych to the point that he tried to pull off election fraud, Putin ended up with a president in Ukraine that he didn't want, and one who wouldn't be open to conciliatory talks with Russia. With his political maneuvering in tatters, Putin instead tried to rely on the KGB to get rid of Ukraine's president. Putin has been accused of attempting to assassinate Yushchenko soon after he took office, with that attempt failing as spectacularly as his attempt to influence the 2004 election in Ukraine. Putin was humiliated. In particular, his ego took a massive shot as the pride he felt as an astute political leader who could effortlessly influence policies in other countries was proven to be false. His efforts had blown up in his face, and he wasn't going to take the humiliation lying down. Though Putin veered away from trying to kill Yushchenko after his first assassination attempt ended, he still tried to have an impact on Ukraine's stability. We see this from multiple gas crises in Ukraine experienced as a result of Russian actions in 2006 and 2009. Both years saw Russia cut gas supplies off, supposedly due to disputes about pricing, with the effects of those cutoffs reverberating far beyond Ukraine. Russia has also spent the last 20 years building pipelines that allow it to circumvent Ukraine, this time creating a situation in which it could cut the country off while still maintaining relationships with other nations. You could argue that this attempt to scuttle Ukraine had a greater impact. A year after the second cutoff, Putin finally got his man, Viktor Yanukovych, in office. Between 2010 and 2014, Yanukovych reigned as president and immediately began making changes to the constitution. Putin had what he wanted, at least for a short time. But then the Euromaidan protests came in 2013 as a direct response to Yanukovych's refusal to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union. Instead, Ukraine's president ignored the country's parliament, which had voted overwhelmingly to approve the deal, and instead chose to create another trade agreement with Russia. As they did following the results of the 2004 election, Ukrainians took to the streets. Violent clashes between protesters and Ukrainian state forces resulted, with Yanukovych ultimately being run out of Ukraine. The country's parliament chose to remove him with a vote of 380 to 0, and Ukraine restored its constitution to what it had been in 2004. Putin had once again lost influence. Russian media cries of a coup fell on deaf ears. However, the protests and ousting of Yanukovych did open the door for Putin to annex Crimea, taking control of the territory away from Ukraine. This was the first sign of the lengths Putin was willing to go to in order to take the entire country. But by this point, he was likely no longer as fueled by a desire to reclaim the former Russia as he had been in the past. He had a personal agenda. Ukraine had humiliated him multiple times. It had gotten rid of the leader he wanted in power twice and survived even when he cut off gas supplies. Even the annexation of Crimea wasn't the victory Putin was hoping for. Ukraine still carried on, building stronger ties with the West as Putin saw the country slipping further and further out of his grip. His ego couldn't take it. And in his arrogance, Putin decided that he could take Ukraine easier by force rather than accepting the country as an independent state over which he had no real control. In this context, we can start to see the war in a different light. While Putin outwardly claims the war is about denazification and the restoration of the old Russia, internally there's a clear element of personal vendetta at play. Ukraine spent nearly 20 years deflecting Putin's influence, political, economic, and even military, showing Putin to be far less powerful as a political player than he believed himself to be. And that leads us to the third reason why Putin launched his war in Ukraine. Personal power may mean more to him than Russian dominance. Putin became Russia's president in December 1999, following a surprise address delivered by former President Boris Yeltsin. It was a rapid rise to power for a man who had only been appointed as Russia's prime minister 4 months previously. And in May 2000, Putin was inaugurated for his first full 4-year term after just scraping through an election with 53% of the nation's vote. No Russian election has been as close ever since. Putin won with 71.9% of the vote in 2004, with the next election taking place 8 years later, despite Russia supposedly having 4-year terms. That one was a little closer, with Putin taking 63.6% of the vote, though his nearest competitor, Gennady Zyuganov, only racked up 17.8%. 6 years later, Putin won another election, this time with 76.69% of the vote, with the most recent 2024 election seeing him take 87.29%. This is Putin's managed democracy in action, a system where he appears to compete with other candidates in elections that some accuse of being rigged. Putin has now tallied 24 years as the president of Russia, with no end in sight, and he'll likely try to maintain that position for the rest of his life. But what's interesting here isn't necessarily the possible rigging of elections over the last 24 years. Rather, Putin has also used war on multiple occasions to justify his position as Russia's leader. Open Democracy notes one theory that suggests the Second Chechen Campaign of 1999 helped Putin achieve his rapid political ascent. From previously being a relative unknown in Russian politics, he rose to become the president less than a year after that campaign, gaining a ton of popular support in the process. While the organization claims that theory likely isn't correct based on opinion polls at the time, Putin himself may believe that being seen as a strong wartime leader helped him to take the reins of power. Later wars, such as his Georgia campaign of 2008 and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, may have been less about claiming territory for Russia as they were creating a situation in which Putin could be seen as a strong leader. Sow some seeds of chaos and encourage the people to back their current leader ahead of anyone who might challenge him. Whatever the case may be, it's clear that Putin's arrogance has led him to believe that he is the only leader that Russia can rely on. He does everything he can to maintain power, with his 2022 invasion of Ukraine possibly being the latest attempt by him to stir up national pride so he keeps himself where he wants to be. And it appears to have worked, at least if you believe Russia's 2024 election results are legitimate. By this point, it's clear that Putin's arrogance is fueled by a combination of his desire to return Russia to its former glory and a need to be seen as the man who did it, a personal vendetta against Ukraine, and his thirst for power. But what Putin doesn't realize is that very arrogance may have placed Russia on the edge of destruction. Let's start explaining why by taking a closer look at the impact the Ukraine war has had on Putin and Russia as a whole. Putin's initial invasion was far from successful. Though Russian troops managed to enter Kyiv, they were repelled in what AP News calls a defeat for the ages. Russia also suffered tremendous losses to its Black Sea fleet and may have lost as many as 342 planes and 325 helicopters, if reports from Ukraine are accurate. Its personnel losses are at least 85,000, with Ukraine claiming they're much higher, which has forced Russia to engage in a war of attrition in which it attempts to wear Ukraine down. That alone has been damaging to Russia. Though the world still views Russia as a strong military power, it's no longer seen as one that can roll over a country that's meant to be substantially weaker than it. Granted, Russia would likely have won in Ukraine already were it not for the international aid that has propped up Kyiv almost since the war began. But Putin's arrogance, in assuming he could take Ukraine in a matter of weeks, has instead revealed Russia's military to be outdated and too reliant on numbers rather than modern equipment and sound strategy. In other words, a stronger country than Ukraine might now feel more confident in its chances of winning a war against Russia in the future. And that's especially the case after they've seen Russia lose so much of its modern equipment, forcing it to repurpose old Soviet hardware to keep its war machine churning. It gets worse for Russia. Whether it wins or loses the war in Ukraine, the country as a whole is going to feel the negative effects for years to come. A loss would likely result in it being stuck with the bill for rebuilding a country it has spent 2 years destroying, as well as Russia having to deal with being a less capable player on the geopolitical stage. It would also likely have to deal with long-running sanctions in the aftermath of a loss, such as a potential extension of the $60 per barrel cap currently in place on Russian oil. Then there's the continuation of other sanctions that have lowered the country's economic gross domestic product, forecast by 7% compared to pre-war estimates. And if Putin wins his war, he'll face the exact same problems. Those who oppose him and Russian aggression as a whole will keep sanctions in place, potentially for years to come. He'll also still need to spend big on rebuilding Ukraine. After all, he claims that it should be part of Russia, and he'll want it to be a functioning part rather than a ghost country that can offer little more than shelled-out buildings. Worse yet for Putin, his rebuilding efforts would likely have to be done under the shadow of continuous Ukrainian resistance, meaning it will likely cost more to rebuild Ukraine if he wins than it would if he loses. Economically, Russia may not be able to survive, no matter the results of Putin's war. That may seem like a strange claim on the surface. The International Monetary Fund expects Russia's economy to grow 3.2% in 2024, which is a full 2 percentage points higher than the UK, and nearly the same amount higher than the EU. Its budget deficit is also much lower than both, tracking at 1% of GDP compared to the UK's 5.1% and the EU's 2.8%. All signs of a thriving economy, right? However, these figures hide the fact that Russia's economy is far from diverse. It relies heavily on exporting oil and gas, with so much of its recent economic growth stemming from the fact that it's able to charge so heavily for both as a result of the war that Putin started. So what happens when the war ends? Russia will be forced to pull those prices back down if it wants to continue selling its main exports, which is when the country will have to wake up to the economic issues that Putin's arrogance has caused. Take how he's spending the country's national budget. Russia is dedicating around 40% of that budget to the wartime effort, with total military spending reaching about 5.9% of GDP in 2023. That money is going toward paying soldiers, building tanks and planes, compensating the families of dead soldiers, and buying equipment from other countries that it can use to fund its war. When the war ends, that entire economic crutch crumbles. The thousands who currently have jobs in Russian factories building military equipment will find themselves out of work. Russia itself will see that it has very little left over in the national budget, and as a result of victory, the country would find itself increasingly isolated from the global community, and the West in particular, leaving it reliant on countries like China to prop it up. Speaking of China, Putin also doesn't realize just how much control Beijing has over Russia's fate. Take oil as an example. With the rest of Europe drastically reducing how much oil it buys from Russia in the wake of Putin's war, now only accounting for 4.5% of purchases, Russia is increasingly relying on China and India to purchase its products. Together, those countries now account for 90% of Russia's crude oil exports, which is a clear example of a lack of diversification. China is the main buyer here, with Reuters pointing out that it now buys 50% of the oil that Russia produces. That's good news for Russia in the short term. It's able to keep bringing oil money in, even as Europe drops from buying 45% of its production to 4%. However, it also leaves the country in a position where it's increasingly reliant on China to fund its economy. That leads to the obvious question: what happens if China stops buying Russian oil? That may not be a far-flung question, given China's recent reaction to threats of sanctions being placed against it for doing business with Russia. Reuters reports that many of China's major banks are pulling back on financing transactions related to Russia, forcing companies to turn to small and less reliable banks, or in some cases cryptocurrency, to continue doing business. The news outlet quotes a banker at one of China's Big Four when talking about the reason. The main reason is to avoid unnecessary troubles. In other words, the banks don't want to be sanctioned, as that could affect Chinese trade globally. While this banking shutdown appears to be mostly related to consumer goods and similar types of businesses, it shows us what China is willing to do if it faces increasing international pressure. Who's to say that it wouldn't stop buying Russian oil or reduce the amount it's paying to meet the $60 cap Western nations have placed on the country's oil if it faced a significant amount of pressure? Either way, it's clear that Putin's arrogance has placed Russia in a no-win situation with China. If it continues relying on China to buy its gas and oil ahead of practically any other nation, it gives Beijing control over its purse strings. That could be a problem if China decides it wants to negotiate lower prices than Russia wants to charge, especially because Russia is quickly losing leverage that would allow it to keep prices high. And if China keeps pulling out of business dealings, as we're seeing as a result of the West's most recent sanction threats, Russia will realize that it's so dependent on China that it's little more than the country's junior partner. Not great for a man who wants to be seen as one of the leaders of the modern world. Certainly not a good outcome for a Russia that's already struggling to prop up an economy that's almost entirely dependent on war, oil, and gas. But Putin's actions haven't just harmed Russia's economy. They've also altered the global perception of the nation. We touched on this earlier when we pointed out that Putin's past failed attempts to control Ukraine ended in failure and exposed him as a less effective leader than he believes himself to be. And even though the world is rightfully wary of the threat Russia presents militaristically, it's also seeing a Russia that's struggling to defeat a much smaller country, albeit one that's being supported by the global community. Putin's arrogance has made Russia look weak, and he has also made himself look like a schoolyard bully. That's according to the Royal United Services Institute, which says that Putin's repeated threats of using tactical nukes in Ukraine are the sign of a man who's growing desperate. He wants Ukraine, the former Soviet territories, and the Western world at large to fear him. Instead, his actions are waking up many other countries to the threat that he presents as Russia's leader, which could, ironically, cause that threat to be limited. The reactions seen in the former Soviet states demonstrate that. In September 2022, Politico reported on the many losses of Russian influence across these states. For instance, Azerbaijan started shelling Armenia again during that month, breaking a ceasefire that Moscow had brokered. It was confident enough to do that because Putin pulled Russia's best troops out of the South Caucasus region, leaving the Russian-backed Armenia exposed. In Georgia, the blue and yellow flag of Ukraine is often flown in support of the embattled nation. Putin also saw himself snubbed by Kazakhstan's President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, who went as far as to claim his country doesn't recognize quasi-state territories, which, in our view, is what Luhansk and Donetsk are. Both are territories Russia currently controls in the war. The point here is that Putin is already struggling to control portions of his supposed empire, with a single war weakening his, and by extension, Russia's influence in these regions. Again, an example of how the Russian president's arrogance is actually weakening his country. Even more worrying are the reactions of the Western world to Putin's invasion. French President Emmanuel Macron has already claimed that NATO troops enter in Ukraine is a possibility. And even though the rest of NATO denies this, Macron hasn't backed down from his comments and even claimed as recently as May 2, 2024, that there's still a possibility that French troops could enter the country. Even the many NATO members who won't commit troops are still sending plenty of aid. The UK recently approved $620 million in aid, with the United States going 100 times bigger. It's approved $61 billion in April. The problem for Russia is that this shows Europe and the Western world at large is slowly waking up to Putin's ambitions. Many countries are now increasing their military budgets in response to Russia's invasion, ultimately meaning they will be able to put up a much stronger fight if Putin tries to coerce or cow them. Far from claiming Ukraine as a great victory for Russia, Putin has galvanized Europe to the point where it will now be much harder for him to achieve his ambitions of returning his country to its Soviet-era glory days. Instead, Russia will just face stronger sanctions, a dearth of clients for its gas and oil, and will have to confront the fact that its economy is now almost wholly reliant on a combination of war and Chinese money. And then there's the last potential nail in the coffin: the massive demographic damage done to Russia as a result of the war. Russians are leaving their home country at a rate of hundreds of thousands. The Economist says that the outbreak of war led to an exodus of 300,000 people, with the BBC saying that estimates for the numbers since range from the hundreds of thousands to several millions. That's all happening against the backdrop of an extended demographic crisis that Russia has experienced since the collapse of the Soviet Union. During the Soviet era, the country's birth rate halved due to the uncertainty its people had as a result of economic hardship. Raising those birth rates has been a cause close to Putin's heart since he took power, and he's failed every step of the way. Our World in Data says that Russia saw just 9.6 births for every 17 deaths in 2021. With the war in Ukraine killing so many of Russia's younger people, along with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more leaving, there may not be much of a Russia left by the time the war is over. All of this adds up to a country in crisis. One that, regardless of how the war in Ukraine ends, is in dire straits economically and in terms of geopolitical positioning. A Russia that's losing people at an alarming rate, and one that, as a result of Putin's arrogance and actions, could find itself playing second fiddle to China rather than rebuilding its empire in the coming years. But what do you think? Will Putin's arrogance truly lead to Russia's downfall? Or will victory in Ukraine give him the launching pad to rebuild what he believes the country has lost? How long would it take for Russia to rebuild in the wake of the war, especially if it loses? The year 2024 has been challenging for Russia in Ukraine. Despite capturing Avdiivka in February and making some advances, these gains have come at a high cost and reveal underlying vulnerabilities. Ukraine has faced ammunition shortages and needed to amend its draft laws in April to boost troop numbers. Meanwhile, Russian forces have struggled to adapt to evolving Ukrainian tactics and have relied on lighter, more mobile units for quick strikes. Economically, Russia is managing wartime demands with help from partners like China, and Vladimir Putin easily managed to get himself re-elected as president. However, public support for the war remains high, only among elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg who are shielded from the war's costs. But what if these apparent successes are built on a foundation of sand? What if the right set of circumstances could lead to a collapse of Russia's war effort? This isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. History is replete with examples of seemingly strong powers faltering unexpectedly. In this video, we'll explore how Ukraine's growing capabilities could pose a significant threat to Russia's current trajectory and reveal the cracks in what seems like a formidable facade. Retired General Ben Hodges, the former commander of US Army Europe, recently went on the Decoding Geopolitics podcast and made some interesting claims. He noted that despite Russia's newfound momentum, it lacked the ability to knock Ukraine out of the war in a decisive moment. Its only option was to continue to grind forward through a mass advantage, taking high casualties in the process. The Kremlin's hope of Western loss of interest in supplying Ukraine, he says, has dissipated for now. However, as a dictator, Putin can keep his war effort going. There's one place where things haven't been going so well for Russia, and it's a place that might surprise you because of how deep behind the front lines it is: Crimea. Unfortunately for the Russians, this is the most important front of all. All wars are political expressions. No matter how successful a state's forces might be on the battlefield, political events on the home front will always be the most determinative factor in the tempo of a conflict. Sun Tzu called this factor the moral law. The moral law causes the people to be in complete accord with their ruler, so that they will follow him regardless of their lives, undismayed by any danger. Sun Tzu listed this ability for the public to be in accord with their ruler as the first factor through which he could predict victory or defeat in a conflict. Kinetic factors were secondary. In this regard, we can identify Crimea as being Putin's Achilles heel. It is not only a vital warm water port, airbase, and supply route for the Russian forces fighting in eastern Ukraine, it's as important of a political objective. Putin's annexation of the peninsula in 2014 was widely seen as his greatest foreign policy achievement before the war. The loss of Crimea after the Soviet Union collapsed was an embarrassment in Russia for deep historical reasons. Putin's recapture of it was his claim to being the equal of some of Russia's greatest rulers. He spent a significant amount of resources in the following years to fortify the peninsula with troops, ships, air bases, and anti-access area denial missiles. He also spent billions to connect it to the Russian mainland via the Kerch Bridge. To make matters worse, if Ukraine were to recapture Crimea, it would be able to completely rebuild to its pre-2014 strength while being a member of NATO. Russia's current hold over the peninsula ensures that even if Ukraine regained all the territory it held before the 2022 invasion, it would be restricted in its access to the sea, especially the Sea of Azov. This would be devastating because, as General Hodges pointed out, two of Ukraine's most important pre-war ports, Berdyansk and Mariupol, were on the Sea of Azov. So even if Ukraine recaptured these cities, they would not add much to its economy as long as Russia maintained Crimea. Other ports like Odessa and Kherson would also be easily disrupted if the Russians decided to use their bases and weapons in Crimea to interdict the shipping. In this interview, General Hodges said that he had spoken to major investors who would not want to take the risk of helping Ukraine to rebuild its economy so long as the Russians can use Crimea to threaten their efforts. Meanwhile, without Crimea, Russia would be unable to effectively check Ukraine and NATO in the Black Sea. Crimea is therefore all-important to protect for the Russian economy, war effort, and political stability of Putin's regime. It's equally important for Ukraine to recapture for a total pre-war recovery. The importance of Crimea brings an interesting historical parallel. In the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, Alexander the Great's army fought a Persian force that significantly outnumbered it. However, Alexander maneuvered his forces so that he would achieve numerical superiority in precisely one sector of the battlefield, the most important one, the one where the Persian king Darius was stationed. Alexander's superiority there forced Darius to retreat. The entire Persian effort then collapsed, despite Alexander's flank being hard-pressed at the time. The same would likely go for Russia and for Putin personally if Crimea were to fall. Ironically, even as Russia is succeeding on other fronts, Crimea is now posing significant problems. Surprisingly, Ukraine has had its best results over the last year in attacking this most heavily fortified of all Russian targets. In the last year, Ukraine has crushed Russia's Black Sea fleet with its sea drone attacks. The fleet has been forced to retreat from its traditional base at Sevastopol to the Russian mainland, ceding control of the Black Sea west of the peninsula to Ukraine. Ukrainian operations against Crimea have succeeded on land and even in the air too. Special operators have knocked out some of the air defenses protecting the peninsula. Ukrainian surface-to-air missile attacks have also shot down or damaged some of Russia's airborne early warning command and control aircraft in the early part of this year. These successes weakened Russia's eyes in the sky over Crimea. According to the Oryx blog, as of May 30th, 2024, Russia has lost 2 of its Beriev A-50 aircraft, which is a severe problem because it only had 9 modernized versions of these beforehand. Missile attacks have also damaged land bases and infrastructure on the peninsula. Critical Russian maintenance bases and even the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet have been damaged or destroyed in these attacks. And things are about to get worse for Crimea. Most of the peninsula was once not in the range of Ukraine's HIMARS systems. To attack it, Kyiv had to take further risks by launching Storm Shadow cruise missiles from aircraft at targets in Crimea. That's recently changed with Ukraine's latest batch of ATACMS missiles. These missiles can be launched from the ground, with the launcher then concealing itself. After 2 years, Russia finally managed to destroy one of Ukraine's HIMARS systems in early March of this year. That has so far been the only confirmed loss of a Ukrainian HIMARS. Ukraine, therefore, got the ability to reliably attack Russian targets at longer ranges with minimal fear of retaliation. Once Ukraine got the longer-range ATACMS, it did not hesitate to use them against targets in Crimea. On April 17th, explosions erupted at the Russian airfield at Zankoy in northeastern Crimea, which hosted 50 combat aircraft and 4 helicopter squadrons. 2 days later, satellite imagery revealed the destruction of between 3 and 5 components for Russia's S-300 and S-400 air defense systems. Ukraine further targeted Russian air defenses in missile strikes on Crimea at the end of April. Units at Cape Tarkankut on the western tip of the peninsula came under missile attack. Ukraine had struck at the same place the previous August. On May 16th, Ukraine launched an ATACMS attack against the Belbek military airfield near Sevastopol. The Russians claimed that they intercepted 10 ATACMS missiles during this event, but that claim is likely as credible as their claims that they destroyed HIMARS systems before March 2024. Satellite images revealed that the attack destroyed 2 MiG-31 fighter jets and 1 Su-27. A fuel storage station near the runway was also destroyed. Perhaps the real target of the attack, a Russian S-400 air defense system, was also destroyed, further weakening Crimea's already deteriorating air defense network across the increasingly vulnerable peninsula. A strategic missile carrier may also have been damaged in the attack, as revealed by satellite imagery taken in the aftermath. These strikes are part of an overall Ukrainian objective to isolate Crimea from the Russian forces in eastern Ukraine and the Russian mainland, which supplies them via the peninsula. This is one of the most important objectives for Ukraine in the war, with President Zelensky claiming that the conflict had started there and would end there. Cutting the connection between the Russian forces in eastern Ukraine and Crimea was the ultimate objective of the Zaporizhzhia offensive in 2023. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the offensive was not successful. When the writing was on the wall, they turned to other, more creative ways of isolating the peninsula and have effectively put it under a loose siege. Crimea may be heavily fortified, but it has an Achilles heel. There are only a few ways to supply it: by sea, by the Kerch Bridge, by a ferry route near the Kerch Bridge, and by rail through southern Ukraine. Aside from attacking military bases and assets in Crimea, Ukraine has also struck at each of these supply routes, and its attacks have become more sophisticated. Because of the effectiveness of Ukraine's sea drones and the retreat of the Black Sea Fleet, it's now impossible for Russia to supply Crimea by sea from the west. Ukraine's drone attacks have also increasingly gone further east, increasing the risks of supplying it from the eastern Black Sea via the Russian mainland. It's no coincidence that Ukraine is asking people around the world to crowdfund its sea drones. They are cheap and have the range needed to disrupt Russian supply routes even this far to the east of Ukraine's lines. The sea route is likely the prime opportunity for Ukraine's now experienced drone operators. In October 2022, Ukraine likely used a sea drone to attack the Kerch Bridge. The explosion did not do severe damage, but it revealed Ukraine's ability to reach the vital route. Ukraine continued targeting the bridge in 2023, doing more damage and impeding movement across it. Repairs took from summer to fall to complete. The bridge remains one of Ukraine's highest priority targets, and unfortunately for the Russians, their enemy now looks like it has the capability to reach out to their prized infrastructure with its new weapons. On the night between May 29th and 30th, the ferry route across the Kerch Strait came under attack. Ukraine used ATACMS missiles to strike the ferry landing on the Crimean side of the strait. The attack severely damaged 2 heavy ferry craft. One of these was for transporting cars, and the other was a train transport. Although the ferry is not the most important of the Crimean supply routes, this incident demonstrates Ukraine's ability to reach deep into this vital military and even more vital political Russian hotspot. The danger to the Kerch Bridge has been increased. General Hodges did not expect Ukraine to bring the Kerch Bridge down with the ATACMS missiles, but rather through a more unconventional plan to make it unusable. However, the most important supply route is not the highest profile one, it's rather the newest and least well known. Since the war began, Russia has constructed a 50-mile railroad that connects Crimea to the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine. From there, the railroad connects the routes into the Russian mainland. Frontelligence Inside, a public intelligence group based in Ukraine, suggested that the new railroad would keep Crimea adequately supplied even if the Kerch Bridge was destroyed. Railroads are a difficult military target. They can be damaged, but only in small stretches. Repairs are easy to make and usually happen quickly. Ukraine has targeted this railway before with its Storm Shadow missiles. However, according to Frontelligence, these operations did not impede the movement of Russian supplies for long. To make matters worse, Ukraine lost expensive ammunition in the process. The trains themselves are also difficult to target, and the Russians often move their freight by night. However, there may be some hope for Ukraine. David Axe in Forbes points out that if the Ukrainians can neutralize the other supply routes to Crimea, they can then concentrate their long-range weapons against the railroad, especially in the new connector between the east and the south. Frontelligence reported, Ukraine currently possesses the means to seriously damage this link, potentially rendering it unusable for weeks or even months. However, this depends on multiple factors, such as the number of air defense systems Russia is willing to allocate to protect vulnerable spots, especially bridges. Fortunately for the Ukrainians, they have had great success against Russia's local air defenses. The remainder of the network is stretched thin. The new ATACMS missiles should give the Ukrainians the ability to stretch that network thinner. Thinner defenses mean more common attacks. This would increase the pressure on Putin. From a political standpoint, the ongoing siege of Crimea has so far been politically manageable for Putin. Because of the Russian state's control over information and ability to quickly punish dissent, he has been able to hand-wave the difficulties the peninsula has faced over the last 9 months. Even the retreat of the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol has not harmed his standing in power. But what if Crimea were to be put in more serious jeopardy? Ukraine is set to ramp up its attacks on all of the new routes. Some analysts worry that Putin would resort to the use of tactical nuclear weapons to preserve Russian control over Crimea. These are low-yield bombs meant to assist movements of friendly troops on the battlefield rather than destroy enemy cities. However, there would be a flaw in this strategy. Aside from risking his connections with vital trade partners like China, which has warned Russia not to use such weapons, India and Turkey, that have been vital in propping up the Russian economy in the face of international sanctions, the tactical nuclear option would not be as effective for the Russian war effort as most news reports indicate. One does not simply blow up nuclear weapons as part of a wartime maneuver. Careful preparations would need to be put in place beforehand, such as providing protective gear for friendly forces in the face of radioactive fallout. However, General Hodges pointed out in the interview that the Russians have allowed this ability to atrophy since the end of the Cold War and would be unprepared to exploit a breakthrough produced by tactical nuclear weapons. Additionally, it's unlikely that Russia would achieve surprise with such weapons. Satellite imagery would pick up the movement of the equipment required to utilize them. Ukraine would be warned long beforehand. Unless Russia would want to needlessly sacrifice its soldiers and alienate even China, the tactical nuclear option is not an attractive one. Though it is true that Russia's military tradition is to sacrifice its troops through waves of attacks that lead to eventual attrition of its enemy, we have seen more than our fair share of that in the current conflict. However, the losses involved in the use of these weapons would outweigh any gains, so a tactical nuclear weapon would be unlikely to save Crimea if things go too far south. What if the worst case for Putin comes to pass and Crimea is lost through siege or storm? Putin would then find his hold on power tenuous. This is an important thing to consider because some Western countries are reluctant to provide Ukraine with enough weapons to make this happen, preferring instead a loose blockade rather than a tight one. General Hodges outlined the two most common arguments against hoping for a change in the Russian government. The first is the idea that someone new would come along that would be even worse than Putin. However, given that Putin has already started the largest war in Europe since World War II and routinely resorts to nuclear threats, it's indeed difficult to see how this successor could be worse. As for the fate of Russia's nuclear weapons, he said that they were kept safe even when the Soviet Union collapsed. Here it's worth noting that because of that event, some of those nuclear weapons were suddenly on foreign soil. Ukraine became the world's third largest nuclear power after 1991. Then it was convinced to return its legacy nuclear weapons to Russia. It likely regrets that decision now. But the point is, the weapons did not fall into the hands of rogue actors. Hodges denied that he was advocating for regime change in Russia, given the United States' poor record in the area. However, he said it would be foolish to not plan for such an eventuality, and also that the West should not let the possibility deter it from supplying Ukraine with the weapons it needs to defeat Russia in the war. For Ukraine to have a serious chance of bringing something resembling these possibilities about, it must tighten the screws around Crimea even more than it has, conducting serious campaigns against all of the Russian supply lines there simultaneously. This will be a tall order, but Ukraine has already demonstrated its success in this area. With the longer-range ATACMS now in place and F-16s set to arrive in Ukraine in the second half of this year, it's now at least getting the tools to pull a tightened siege off. After its annexation in 2014, Russia turned Crimea into one of the most heavily fortified places in the world. Perhaps only the Korean demilitarized zone had more formidable defenses. Few would have imagined that one of Ukraine's most successful campaigns in the war would be against this place, but that's exactly what's happened. A less well-armed Ukraine has steadily eroded Russia's ability to use Crimea as a base of power projection. A Ukraine with longer-range missiles and modernized fighter jets may be able to make supplying it much more difficult, increasing the risks to Putin personally. The war in Ukraine is a long, attritional contest. Hopes in 2023 that a new Ukrainian offensive would end it proved to be misguided. However, if there is a location which could end the war in a decisive moment, it is Crimea. If Putin gets embarrassed here too badly, it will likely be game over. How vulnerable do the new ATACMS missiles and F-16s make Crimea? Will Ukraine be able to continue its success on this most important target of the war with its latest weapons?
The Soviet Union's notorious economic blunders led to its collapse, yet Russia seems to have learned little. President Vladimir Putin's recent decisions show that economic mismanagement is still rampant, threatening to doom the country once again. This time, these mistakes might also drag down the Russian army. Putin's war economy aims to sustain military operations, but a fully militarized economy can only go so far before collapsing under its own weight. Ignoring practical realities and the well-being of the forces only accelerates the downfall. Poor decisions are fracturing the structure meant to project power, jeopardizing military effectiveness and national stability. In this video, we explore how these economic missteps are undermining Russia's military and the nation's future. And this is precisely what happens in Russia, and precisely what this video will look into. But before we get to the unraveling, let's trace the path of Putin's economic missteps and the misguided decisions setting the stage for this looming collapse. Though Putin has never been particularly wise in his economic strategies, his ruthless invasion of Ukraine is undoubtedly what triggered the beginning of the end for the Russian army. You see, when Putin first launched the invasion against Ukraine, he expected Kyiv to crumble in a matter of days, securing a swift and decisive victory. Instead, he was met with unyielding resistance both on and off the battlefield. The resistance off the battlefield, the formidable response from the international community, was what tanked the Russian economy faster than Putin expected Kyiv to fall. Immediately after the invasion, the economic activity in Russia contracted by 4.4%. In a matter of days, the Russian currency, the ruble, lost over 40% of its external value. After that, it was one thing after another. Western companies soon started pulling out from Russia left and right. The country's assets were frozen. Its energy exports were targeted, and ultimately the Russian economy was isolated from the global financial systems. The sweeping international sanctions that made all this possible had a single goal: to weaken Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine, and at first, it seemed that they would be successful. After all, there was no doubt about it, Russia's economy was on the brink of collapse. But in an unexpected twist, these sanctions, described as crippling, debilitating, and unprecedented by Western commentators, didn't bring about Russia's anticipated downfall. Instead, the Russian economy displayed a surprising resilience in 2023, allowing Putin to continue his aggressive stance. Quite expectedly, the Russian authorities bragged about the economy's 3.6% growth loudly and publicly, praising themselves for avoiding a deep recession in 2022. Much of this growth can be attributed to a single factor: the expansion of the military-industrial complex. It's probably after seeing that the military was the one to save the Russian economy from a more severe downturn that Putin decided to make it the foundation of the country's economic strategy. On paper, this decision seems to be a successful one, as the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, forecast a 3.2% growth for the Russian economy in 2024. This prediction, made in April 2024, was even higher than the organization's January estimate, which saw Russia's gross domestic product, or GDP, rising to 2.6%. What was perhaps even more shocking than the optimistic growth forecast was that Russia was expected to pass some of the strongest economies in the West in terms of GDP growth.
According to the IMF, the US is expecting a growth rate of 2.7%, France 0.7%, the UK 0.5%, and Germany 0.2% for the same year, 2024. But let's remember one thing: Russia has always looked better on paper than it performed in reality. As history shows, superficial economic metrics like these frequently obscure deeper vulnerabilities that can lead to sudden and severe destabilization. That's why many experts warn that the talk of Russia's miraculous economic resilience is severely misguided. As Mark Sobel, the US chair of the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, puts it, Russia is masking a process of significant economic degradation that will continue well into the future and further marginalize its global footprint. But in a surprise to no one, Putin is doubling down on his economic strategies, driven by the belief that further militarization is the key to maintaining power and influence. With this in mind, let's take a closer look at the war economy and its main pillars, exploring how it's setting the stage for the Russian army's collapse. A single principle lies at the core of Putin's war economy. When public money is allocated wisely, it delivers results. Putin seems to believe that the wise allocation in question is massive military expenditures, while the desired result is saving the country's economy rather than bankrupting it. Of course, this principle is nothing new. This economic model has been shaped by decades of Soviet-era fallacies and delusional beliefs. This model is only new in the sense that Putin has never used it before the invasion of Ukraine. You see, when Putin assumed power in Russia, it was in the wake of the 1990s liberal reforms. In his early years in office, he even appeared to advocate for significant restructuring and liberalization of the Russian economy. Today, you can only find the faintest traces of liberalism in who Putin chooses to keep in charge of various aspects of the Russian finances. Now, Anton Siluanov, the Minister of Finance, Elvira Nabiullina, the Governor of the Bank of Russia, and Maxim Oreshkin, Putin's economic advisor, are in no way liberal. However, they can be described as rational technocrats who prioritize stability. So why does Putin keep them around? Well, Putin might be a lot of things, but he isn't stupid. He knows the importance of maintaining strong macroeconomic indicators and economic stability to preserve his grip on power. He was well taught by several liberal economists at the beginning of his rule, including Alexei Kudrin and Anatoly Kubayis. But the question is, how long will Putin be able or willing to sustain this precarious balance? As things stand, it seems that he's gradually moving away from any balance and diving headfirst into a risk-laden economic strategy. This shouldn't be surprising, given how strongly the people around Putin believe in Russia's so-called special military operation in Ukraine. This misguided cult-like belief single-handedly fueled the conviction that exorbitant government spending on the military-industrial complex could not only sustain the war effort, but also sustain and even grow Russia's economy. So how exorbitant are we talking? So exorbitant that it almost reached the scale of the Soviet-era military spending during the Cold War. Of course, we're referring to the total amount of money being spent and not the share of GDP used for what Russia shamelessly calls defense and security purposes. After all, it's well known that the Soviet Union spent upwards of 20% of its GDP on defense while trying to portray itself as the boogeyman to the West. Today, only Ukraine exceeds this percentage, allocating as much as 37% of its GDP to its defense amidst the ongoing conflict. As for Russia, the country is committing roughly 7% of its GDP to defense, amounting to around $140 billion. For comparison's sake, Russia was spending only $65.91 billion on defense in 2021 before the invasion, which was around 3.72% of its GDP at the time. Even when the invasion first started in 2022, the military spending couldn't come close to what it is today. In 2022, Russia's military budget was $86.37 billion, or 4.06% of its GDP. However, it's important to note that a huge portion of Russia's federal budget, almost a quarter of it, is still kept secret. Given everything we know about Putin's plans, it's safe to assume that the actual war-related spending in Russia's federal budget is even higher, significantly higher. It goes without saying that such an absurd scale of military spending is only feasible under an autocratic regime. A regime willing to prioritize guns over butter to achieve its end goal, which in this case is Russia's special mission. If you aren't familiar with the guns versus butter model, here's a brief explanation. The guns are the government's investments in military capabilities. The butter is civilian needs and welfare. So the guns versus butter argument simply refers to the trade-offs between these two competing priorities. Under this model, an autocratic regime like Russia's can skew heavily toward guns and neglect butter almost completely. After all, it's not like it will face any public scrutiny or opposition. To Putin's credit, he hasn't entirely given up on the butter, at least not publicly. What he did was instruct his economists to find a balance between guns and butter. His exact words were,
While increasing our defense and security expenditures, we bear in mind that all our social obligations to the people must be fulfilled and that our national development goal must be achieved in all spheres, including in social protection. He further explained that he primarily referred to education, healthcare, and support for veterans. Of course, Russia's federal budget lacks the necessary money for all this butter, so this part will have to be handled by the market sector, which continues to function in Putin's Russia thanks to the foundation laid by the reforms of Russia's former Prime Minister, Yegor Gaidar, over 3 decades ago. So we have a market economy, the dominant emphasis on the military-industrial complex, and state interventionism. This fascinating mix has prompted many analysts to conclude that Russia is on the path of adopting an economic policy resembling military Keynesianism. If you aren't familiar with the term, military Keynesianism is an economic theory that advocates for increased government spending as a means to stimulate economic growth and employment. The equation is simple. Invest in the military sector heavily and you'll get more economic activity, jobs, and technological advancements. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? For a prime example of military Keynesianism, all you need to do is look at Nazi Germany or the US during the Cold War. In Nazi Germany, extensive military spending was used to prepare for a potential war with Slavic nations. Under Adolf Hitler's regime, military spending reached approximately 40% of Germany's GDP by 1940, compared to 8% in 1935. This surge in defense spending was instrumental in reviving the German economy, reducing unemployment from over 34% in 1933 to under 2% by 1939. Similarly, during the Cold War, the US invested heavily in defense and technological advancements, so by the 1960s, defense spending reached close to 10% of the country's GDP. Even then, there were numerous questions about how sustainable military Keynesianism truly is. Some experts believe that spending a lot of money on military production, which is essentially a form of high-tech production, leads to the development of the technological sector as a whole. The result, the subsequent innovations benefit the civilian economy. Others, however, strongly believe that advances in military technology have almost nothing to do with the civilian sector. Essentially, they claim that the military-industrial complex robs the civilian economy of vital resources, including workers, which in no way can help the overall economy. By now, it's quite clear which side Putin is on. The one that believes, or tries to desperately cling to, the notion that military spending serves as a driver of development. This was made abundantly clear by the shakeups in Putin's cabinet, which have shocked the world. By this, we primarily refer to the dismissal of Sergei Shoigu as Russia's defense minister. Now, don't get us wrong, this move was by no means shocking from a strategic standpoint. Shoigu's departure was the culmination of mounting criticisms and failures during the war in Ukraine, so there was nothing surprising about it. The shocking part is that Shoigu has been one of Putin's closest allies for decades, a trusted confidant who had weathered many storms alongside him. This had led some to believe he would be safe from such upheaval. Well, as it turns out, no one's safe when a dictator's country is unraveling after getting badly beaten by a supposedly inferior foe. In such dire straits, even the closest allies become liabilities, and the once unshakable pillars of power are ruthlessly dismantled in the scramble to salvage a crumbling regime. But who is Shoigu, and more importantly, who was he replaced with? Sergei Shoigu, a seasoned figure in Russian politics, served as the Minister of Defense from 2012 to 2024. His tenure was marked by extensive military reforms and a significant buildup of Russia's armed forces. So it's no wonder Putin entrusted him with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, ordering him to capture Kyiv in a matter of days. To be fair, this order was inherently impossible to achieve, as it underestimated both the resilience of the Ukrainian forces and the complexities of urban warfare. Can you really expect some 190,000 troops and tens of thousands of vehicles to effortlessly storm an area of 324 square miles with 3.5 million residents in the dead of winter? Though a resounding no is the obvious answer, Putin was never the one to accept the obvious. So he failed, and Shoigu failed. However, Shoigu's failure to secure a swift victory in Kyiv wasn't the only issue at hand. As the war dragged on and Russian losses mounted, Shoigu's position became increasingly untenable. That was what eventually led to his dismissal in May of 2024, while it was at least partially responsible. You see, Shoigu's failures, as well as the Russian government's crackdown on corruption among the high-ranking defense officials, weren't the only reason why he was removed as defense minister. The move actually had more to do with who the new defense minister is, rather than the missteps of the former one. If you need proof, all you need to know is that Shoigu wasn't banished from the government altogether. Instead, he was appointed the Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, which is quite a high-profile, and dare we say lucrative, position. So who's the new defense minister that warrants all this intrigue? The answer is Andrei Belyusov, an economic technocrat.
Before he assumed office as the defense minister, Belousov served as the first deputy prime minister from 2020 to 24, an aide to the president in economic affairs from 2013 to 20, and minister of economic development from 2012 to 13. As you can see, there's no mention of any military-related positions in his extensive resume. That's because Belousov has no military experience whatsoever. From this fact alone, it's easy to conclude that Putin is no longer viewing the Russo-Ukrainian war as a battle of military might alone. Now the war has become a battle of resources. In other words, Putin finally realized he couldn't achieve a lightning victory, and it only took him 2.5 years to come to that realization, and that he must brace for the long game. Of course, the mere notion of Putin preparing his country for long-term warfare terrifies both Ukraine and the remainder of Europe. This move only confirms what many in Europe have feared for months: Putin won't stop at Ukraine. But many people fail to understand one thing. It's not so much that Putin wants to continue fighting, as much as he can't afford to stop. What do we mean by that? As Renaud Foucault, a senior lecturer at the Department of Economics at Lancaster University Management School, explains, the war in Ukraine has become the main driver of Russia's economic growth. However, this war is also responsible for decimating Russia's economy in other crucial ways. So if Russia were to stop fighting, it would have to deal with the economic reality of a nation burdened by sanctions, a diminished workforce, and a deteriorating infrastructure. This might lead to social unrest and a potential collapse of the fragile stability that Putin's regime desperately clings to. Paradoxically, even winning in Ukraine could spell trouble for Russia. How so? The country simply doesn't have the means to rebuild the occupied areas that would come under its control, nor to maintain security in them. So for Russia, the only viable course of action is to keep fighting in Ukraine, in the Baltic, in the entirety of Europe. That's why Putin needs an economist as the defense minister, as only an economist can navigate the treacherous waters of sustaining a war-driven economy. Putin himself stated that only an economist can make the country's military budget, which has now reached gargantuan proportions, efficient. With Putin's comment to the long war in mind, you can probably start to see why this new economic model spells doom for the Russian army. So let's finally dive into it. You've probably noticed that the focus of Putin's new economy has solely been on the military-industrial complex so far. In other words, the focus is on the weapons and equipment. But what about the people handling those weapons? The soldiers, the officers, the very backbone of any military force. How are they faring under this economic shift? In short, not great. And that might be the understatement of the century. Only about 30% of the entire military budget is spent on the army itself. The rest is allocated to weapons procurement and production. And not even the whole 30% is dedicated to military salaries. Approximately 20% of the budget goes to pay. At the same time, vast sums are siphoned off through corruption and inefficiency, a problem that Belousov is ostensibly trying to address. Of course, trying is the key word here, as Russia's Minister of Defense still seems to act as merely an intermediary between the state budget and the military industry. The industry is the one that holds virtually all the power. This particularly applies to one man, Sergei Chemezov. Chemezov, an oligarch and the CEO of Rostec Corporation, a state-owned defense conglomerate, seemingly has more influence over Putin than Belousov. Putin confirmed this by appointing Denis Manturov, former Minister of Industry and Trade, the first deputy prime minister after Belousov's promotion. Manturov is Chemezov's close confidant, which means that his promotion allows Chemezov to continue heavily profiting from the surge in military spending. And while Chemezov and his ilk make absurd amounts of money, it's the common soldier that suffers. From the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022 to July 19, 2024, 564,620 Russian troops have been casualties in Ukraine. That's according to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. That's almost 0.4% of the entire Russian population. The last time Russia experienced such extensive casualties was during World War II, when approximately 8.7 million military personnel died over 6 years of intense conflict. It's worth remembering that World War II is the deadliest military conflict in history, involving over 100 million people from more than 30 countries. The war in Ukraine, on the other hand, has only been waged between two countries for a little over 28 months. The sheer fact that it's produced such staggering losses highlights the unprecedented ferocity and scale of the ongoing conflict. These shocking figures underscore another thing: the utmost disregard for the lives of Russian soldiers. Putin seems to be hell-bent on pursuing his strategic goals at any cost, even if it means sacrificing the very troops meant to achieve his ambitions. That's why the most common tactic employed by the Russian army is the so-called meat grinder strategy, which involves overwhelming enemy positions with massive waves of infantry. Prioritizing sheer numbers over strategic precision, this approach has only resulted in one thing: horrific casualties.
As far as Putin is concerned, he can always just get more soldiers. After all, the boost in the economy allows him to hire contract soldiers who flock to the Russian army for the $2,300 monthly paycheck. If all else fails, he can just carry out another wave of forced conscriptions, compelling more Russians to join the ranks and fill the gaps left by the staggering losses. He did so in August 2022 with 137,000 people, and in December 2023 with another 170,000. This relentless churn of personnel underscores a grim reality. For Putin, human lives are expendable, and as long as his economy can sustain this horrifying soldier turnaround, that's all they'll ever be. Mere cogs in this brutal war machine. But what about Belousov? What's his role in all of this? Well, as soon as he was appointed defense minister, he stated that equipping the Russian armed forces would be his first priority. As he put it, everything that is effective in the country should be put to work to achieve victory. Now, to be fair, equipping the Russian army isn't a futile endeavor, as many of the troops have complained about being sent into battle without adequate gear and support. Yet Belousov's focus on this aspect reveals a critical flaw. He's aiming to enhance a system that already devalues human life, rather than addressing the underlying issues that perpetuate the catastrophic loss of soldiers. The grim reality is that improving equipment without reforming the underlying strategy and leadership will only make the meat grinder more efficient and more deadly. The Russian army's morale is already at a record low, so no amount of improved gear will prevent the continuing spiral into chaos and despair, especially when the improvements in question are coming from someone who is a complete outsider to the Russian army. Remember, Belousov isn't a military man. He's a laboratory academic who hasn't even served in the military as a conscript. In fact, he's probably never even held a gun. So how can he expect to inspire confidence or make meaningful changes when he lacks the most basic understanding of military life and combat needs? Belousov's background in economics and academia, while valuable in its own right, simply doesn't translate into an intuitive grasp of the realities faced by soldiers on the front lines. However, it's also worth remembering that Shoigu has also never been in the military, which didn't prevent him from sporting a general's uniform decked out in medals. But despite his lack of personal combat experience, Shoigu embraced the military traditions and an image crafted to exude authority and command respect. He seemed like he wanted to run the Russian army himself. And as you already know, playing pretend goes a long way in Russia, a country where appearances and titles often overshadow substance. So while trying to get the black hole of military spending under control, Belousov is likely to only weaken the Russian army, eroding what's left of its effectiveness and morale. Of course, there's also the question of the long-term future of the Russian army. Even though Russia is undoubtedly preparing for a long fight, Benjamin Hilgenstock of the Kiev School of Economics believes that the war must end at some point. When this happens, the military spending will come down again. But what will happen to the army veterans? Will Russia have the funds to reward them and glorify them as it used to do almost religiously? Not likely. As a result, the veterans might find themselves abandoned, left to face the harsh reality of what Russia truly is. And with the widespread disillusionment, both among those who fought and the general public, comes the shattering of Russia's military legacy once and for all. So what was once believed to be the second strongest army in the world will inevitably crash and burn. And all of this because one man decided to play real-life Risk. Do you agree? Is the Russian army done for, or can it still recover from this catastrophic gamble?
All is not as it seems with Russia's economy. Despite recording economic growth, Russia is on the verge of being bankrupted by the Ukraine war due to a combination of economic factors that, if left unchecked, will lead it to facing over a decade of economic regress. In other words, Putin is setting up Russia for a potentially devastating economic crisis that will last long after he's gone. In this video, we'll explore the various factors that are leading Russia toward bankruptcy, each of which has been impacted by the Ukraine war, to reveal why the country's growth figures are not as they seem. We start with the immediate impact of the war. According to the Center for Economic Policy and Research, or CEPR, the months that immediately followed Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine were painful on the domestic front. The country's economy contracted by 4.4% in a matter of weeks, with Russia finding itself on the verge of immediate financial collapse. People were queuing in the streets to withdraw their money from banks, while the Russian ruble saw a 40% drop in its external value. Russia had to act fast to reverse these immediate effects. One of its actions was to hike interest rates to 20%, which then, combined with introduction of new capital controls, managed to place the country's economy back on a stable footing. Putin also announced increased spending on public services, starting with housing and later expanding into the military. The crisis was averted, at least in the short term. Putin's responses to the economic issues that immediately followed the war's beginning placed Russia on course to become a wartime economy. We'll cover that issue in more detail later, First, it's important to note the sheer cost of the Ukraine war to Russia, between $500 million and $1 billion per day. Ground Report revealed these figures in May 2022. Writing about a study published by the Center for Economic Recovery, it pointed out the first 5 days of the war alone cost Russia somewhere in the region of $7 billion. That amounts to $1.4 billion per day. Granted, these costs would fall, as the initial invasion was intended to be a smash-and-grab operation, in which Russia poured many of its best soldiers and equipment into Ukraine in an effort to conquer the country quickly. When that failed, Russian spending would decrease, though it remains at a high level. Importantly, the study only included direct losses, such as equipment and the cost of personnel, in the $7 billion figure. It also noted the human losses during those first 5 days would likely cost Russia a further $2.7 billion in GDP in the years that followed the war. As the war evolved from a smash and grab into a war of attrition, new figures started to emerge. For instance, US military expert Robert Farley claimed that Russia was spending around $500 million per day, though the actual figure may be much higher. That's according to Ukraine.ru, which is a Russian-operated website owned by the Russia Today state-owned media company. They claim that the cost of a single day of the special military operation could be as high as $20 billion. Other reports base their cost on Russia's past wars. Ground Report notes that Russia spent $2.4 million per day on its special military operation in Syria. That operation saw it commit 1,600 troops. By May 2022, Russia had already sent 149,000 soldiers into Ukraine. A little maths shows us that this would lead to a daily cost of $223.5 million per day, though that doesn't account for the much larger equipment load in the Ukraine war, or the fact that Russia has committed hundreds of thousands more soldiers to Ukraine since May 2022. Sean Spoontz, the editor-in-chief of the SOFREP media outlet, had his own figures during these early months of the war. Speaking to Newsweek, he claimed that Russia was likely spending $900 million per day to provide its soldiers with ammunition and equipment, as well as to repair and replace damaged equipment. He also pointed out how easily costs can add up, noting that each of the thousands of cruise missiles Russia was launching at the time came with a price tag of $1.5 million. So the figures clearly vary depending on the source. But even when focusing on the potential low end of $223.5 million per day, it's clear that the cost of Russia's special military operation is astronomical. Assuming the figure is true, Russia has been at war with Ukraine for 885 days at the time of the creating of this script. That would put the total direct cost of the war to Russia at $197.79 billion. Spoontz's $900 million per day figure makes the situation appear even worse, as that means Russia has spent a staggering $796.5 billion. The real number likely lies somewhere in between those two. Either way, it's clear that Putin has spent enormously to wage a concerted war against Ukraine. Still, this alone isn't enough to bankrupt Russia. As Statista reports, the country is estimated to have a GDP of $2.056 trillion in 2024 alone, with similar figures seen in 2023 and 2022. In other words, it's generating enough money to cover direct daily costs of the war, even if covering those costs results in economic challenges for the average Russian on the street. But therein lies a problem. The costs discussed so far are only direct, meaning they merely cover how much Russia is spending on military wages and the equipment that it's using during the special military operation. While damaging enough to Russia alone, those direct costs can become a severe problem when combined with indirect economic challenges that have arisen since February 2022. We'll start with the most obvious point: economic sanctions. Since February 2022, the US, UK, and European Union have combined with countries including Canada, Japan, and Australia to impose at least 16,500 sanctions against Russia. Many of these countries have also frozen Russian currency reserves held in their banks, believed to amount to around $350 billion. With some being on the verge of permitting Ukraine to use those funds in its fight against Russia. These include the countries that make up the G7 economic group, which has agreed to provide $50 billion of the frozen assets to Ukraine in the form of a loan. The G7 also levied a sanction against Russian oil. In this case, the West isn't going to stop buying the oil that Russia produces. However, it has imposed a maximum price of $60 per barrel, all with the goal of reducing Russia's earnings from its lucrative energy sector. Granted, Russia has found ways to circumvent some of these sanctions. The Atlantic Council claims it has a shadow fleet of around 1,000 oil tankers that it's using to sell oil abroad for more than $60 per barrel. And given that it's increased oil supplies to India and China to the tune of 8.3 million barrels per day, it's managing to replace the losses caused by the G7's lowered prices and many European countries moving away from Russia as its main oil supplier. That doesn't mean the sanctions have had no impact. The US Treasury estimates that sanctions have cut 5% from the economic growth Russia might have experienced had it not started the war. Plus, it was likely sanctions that were primarily responsible for the early shrinking of Russia's economy during the months immediately following the invasion. And even with the limitations imposed on these sanctions, many were phased in gradually rather than being implemented immediately. They've at least forced Russia to change its economic policy. That's according to the Carnegie Endowment, which noted that sanctions have effectively prevented Russia from diversifying its economy. Prior to the special military operation, Russia had a system of state capitalism focused on technological development. This wasn't to replace its energy sector, which is still and would remain a key driver of Russia's economy, but would supplement it. Now Russia has the previously mentioned capital controls in place and has militarized much of its budget spending, meaning there's little money left to spend on the diversification of its economy. That isn't impacting Russia too badly right now, and it'll likely continue recording growth for as long as the war continues. However, when the war ends, regardless of whether Russia wins or loses, it'll be left with an economy that has lost its focus on the technological development that was helping it to diversify. Russia will find itself back where it's been for so many years, relying on gas and oil to prop itself up in the short term, only to find itself potentially impacted by economic shocks later down the line. There's also the hostile issue to consider. In switching to an economic system that features capital controls, Putin has also started labeling almost any country involved in levying sanctions as hostile. Russia has no real guidelines on what hostile actually means, according to the Carnegie Endowment, but the term appears to be the main determining factor in Russia's trade relationships right now. That's why it's doing more business with the likes of Iran, North Korea, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey. It's even joined up with the Taliban to form an infrastructure consortium in Afghanistan, a move that sees it unite with an age-old enemy. So Russia finds itself in a strange place as a result of sanctions. It's being forced to replace reliable Western trade partners with far less reliable partners in Asia and Africa. Again, that's fine in the short term. The problem for Russia will come after the war if the West decides to continue to isolate it. That could force Russia to continue its shift away from state capitalism, at least as it knew it before, while forcing the country to increasingly depend on the limited number of foreign partners it's been able to maintain. In other words, a complete reversal of the diversification it had been trying to achieve before the war. The point here is that sanctions had an immediate impact, with Russia's solutions to that impact all being short-term focused. Those solutions will work for now, and likely for the duration of the war, but the future doesn't hold much hope for Russia in terms of the diversification of its economy. Any issue could lead the country toward bankruptcy. Then there are the two Ds: debt and deficit. In July 2022, the World Economic Forum, or WEF, announced that Russia had been forced to default on all of its foreign debts, marking the first time this had happened since 1918. Note that this was the year that World War I ended, which left Russia war-ravaged and struggling. The most recent default came at a time when Russia was supposed to be much stronger economically, with the WEF noting that this need to default was another sign that Western sanctions were working. Defaulting creates another problem for Russia. The country will lose access to global investors due to the default, more on that later, and has created a situation in which it's viewed as an increased credit risk. Any foreign organizations that lend money to Russia will now demand higher interest rates and more stringent conditions for their loans. This defaulting also displays how limiting Russia's access to its currency reserves has impacted its economy. The WEF notes that the default came on the back of Russia's failure to repay $100 million in interest on a pair of bonds within a 30-day grace period. Russia claims it made the payment. It says the money got held up by the Euroclear clearinghouse, with the failure likely down to Russia trying to pay its debt in rubles. The problem here is that each bond issued to Russia has a prospectus, which specifies the currency in which interest must be paid. Not having access to that currency due to sanctions and asset freezing means Russia is being forced to default, even in cases where it's got the money to repay. Due to that, the money Russia has coming in from foreign partners who continue to trade with it now means less. It can't be used to repay debts, meaning that Russia again faces a long-term problem. If it ever gets back to the point where Western countries are willing to do business with it again, that business will come at a far higher cost. It's yet another future issue created by Putin's current economic policy. As for the deficit, the UK-based Express newspaper shines a light on what's happening. In March 2024, it reported on the surprising growth of Russia's economy, even including a quote from Putin in which he claimed, "They predicted decline, failure, collapse, that we would stand back, give up, or fall apart. They won't succeed. Our economy is growing, unlike theirs." Again, the surface-level figures make it hard to argue with Putin. given that Russia is projected to achieve record-breaking economic growth in 2024. However, the outlet also quotes author Owen Matthews and his points that Russia is very quickly burning through its cash reserves. Owen, an expert on Russian policy who has penned several books, including Overreach, the inside story of Putin and Russia's war against Ukraine, claims that Russia is spending $4.4 billion a month of the cash reserves held in its National Wealth Fund. By the end of 2023, that fund was down to $56 billion, a drop in the ocean compared to how much Putin is spending to wage war against Ukraine. That fund would be key to the plans that Putin outlined in his annual State of the Union address, in which he claimed he aims to improve the average Russian's standard of living. That will be a costly task, with Astra Asset Management Investment Director Dmitry Polovoy noting that it would cost at least $130 billion to put Putin's plans into action. That's all money that the National Wealth Fund simply doesn't have. Russia is in a bad spot. It's spending hundreds of millions of dollars per day on the Ukraine war, and it's likely to be impacted negatively by sanctions in the long term. Every measure Putin has put in place to relieve the impact of those sanctions is a short-term fix, including Russia's increased reliance on its energy assets and the few foreign partners it has left. All the while, it's seeing assets get frozen, it's defaulting on debts, and it's draining its national wealth fund. In short, Russia's economic growth appears to be a smokescreen, covering up severe financial problems that will harm the country long after the war in Ukraine ends. And it gets worse for Putin and Russia as a whole. Earlier we mentioned that Russia hiked its base interest rates up to 20% in the months following the war. That rate had slowly been coming down to the point where it reached 16% by mid-2024, but the decrease is set to be reversed. In July 2024, Reuters reported that Russia's central bank was preparing to increase its key interest rate again, this time by 200 basis points, which would bring the rate up to 18%. Should the rise go through, it'll be because Russia is being forced to deal with the combination of an overheated economy and rampant inflation. Reuters notes that acute labor shortages, wage growth across multiple sectors, the enormous state spending on the war, and continued increases in retail and corporate lending are collectively to blame for the country's inflation rate running at 9.2%. That's 5.2% over the 4% target the Russian central bank sets for the country. This raises a couple of questions. What does this news mean for Russia's people, and why would Russia want to cool its economy at all? Starting with the second question, the cooling is desired because Russia wants to lower corporate and retail lending rates, which have continued to grow even as inflation has climbed. Russia's central bank recognizes that much of the economic growth the country has seen has come as a result of defense sector spending, and it knows that over-reliance on this economic sector is problematic. Of course, it faces opposition. Many in the defense sector want to see the rates stay at 16% or even decline because lower rates mean they can borrow more money. More borrowing leads to more production, which they argue could lead to economic growth reaching 5% for the year. The problem with that growth is that it comes at the cost of the Russian people, which brings us to answer the first question. Even though Russia's wages are increasing, the cost of everyday goods has increased right along with them. Russia is still struggling with over 9% inflation at a time when most of the Western world has gotten its inflation issues under control. Raising interest rates will bring inflation closer to the desired 4% mark, relieving Russia's ongoing cost of living crisis. The flip side is that raising the base rate to 18% makes loans less accessible to regular citizens, resulting in less money being spent on consumer products. Russia's central bank is stuck between a rock and a hard place, and that's only going to get worse when the wartime economy ends. That brings us back to something we touched upon earlier in the video. The vast majority of Russia's growth is being fueled by the Ukraine war. In February 2024, The Conversation published an article in which it delved into the state of the Russian economy. Like other articles, it noted that Russia has managed to get around many of these sanctions imposed upon it, at least in the short term. But it also claimed those sanctions don't represent the biggest threat to the country. Instead, the major problem is a lack of economic diversity, a problem only made worse by the war. As mentioned earlier, Russia has pulled investment away from technological development to focus on funding its war. That means oil and gas are still its main sources of income and are, in fact, more important to Russia's economy than ever before. Accompanying this has been a massive increase of around 40% to Russia's public spending budget, almost all of which has gone toward funding the Ukraine war. By the end of 2023, Russia's military spending reached around 10% of its GDP. For context, the United States, which spends more on its military than any other country, will spend 2.9% of its GDP on its military in 2024, with that number dropping to 2.5% by 2034. An entire defense industry had been rebuilt due to the war. with Russia also having to shell out billions for soldier pay, tanks, planes, and the compensation they're paying to families of dead and wounded soldiers. This is all happening amidst the previously mentioned inflation and interest rate problems. Plus, as Yahoo Finance points out, direct investment in Russia is on the decline. The first 3 quarters of 2023 saw this type of investment drop by $8.7 billion. And it gets worse for Russia. According to CEPR, production in industries related to the war has naturally rocketed up, being 60% higher in the spring of 2024 than it was during the fall of 22. That's a consequence of Putin ramping up production to keep pace with the sheer volume of losses, both personnel and equipment-wise, that Russia has experienced in Ukraine. But as touched on before, that increase in wartime production means sacrifices are being made elsewhere. Practically every non-war manufacturing sector in Russia is either flat or in decline. Russia is also still heavily reliant on its energy-related income to fund public spending on wartime activities. Interestingly, says CEPR, this wartime economy has actually seen some of Russia's poorest areas grow at a faster rate than they otherwise would. But therein lies a problem. That growth is coming at the cost of other areas. There is distortion at play within the Russian economy, exacerbated by its military spending, meaning the country's economy is being set up for a rough ride once the war ends. How rough a ride? According to CEPR, economic growth will likely fall to 1% or less per year in the long run due to a combination of factors. Labor won't be a source of growth. More on that in a moment, as Russia has seen a mass exodus along with thousands of its people dying in the war. The heavy investment into wartime productivity has also slowed down productivity elsewhere. This is especially the case in the technology sector, which has seen investment flatline to the point where it'll be far behind the most advanced nations in the world by the time the war ends. Russia can't even rely on direct investment. It's likely to be isolated from capital markets even after the war, meaning most investment will have to come from internal sources. The only 2 things the Russian economy has going for it are high oil prices and its wartime economy. That's what has led some to speculate that Russia can't afford to win or lose the war. Either way, the wartime economy it's created comes to an end, and production, at least at the level we're seeing, ceases. That results in thousands of people out of jobs, while Russia tries to shift its economy back to the state capitalist model of old, which will be under the cloud of frozen assets and the depletion of its cash reserves due to the war. Feeding into these issues is a problem we've already touched upon: labor. According to a BBC report from June 2023, anywhere between 600,000 and 1 million Russians left their country in 2022. Many did so either in protest against the war or out of fear that they will be conscripted into the Russian army. Either way, that's up to 1 million people, and perhaps more in the years since, who have left Russia and can no longer contribute to its workforce. Add to that the casualties Russia has experienced. Ukraine's official war website puts the number at 468,840 troops as of May 1, 2024, with the likelihood being that several 100,000 more will lose their lives as a result of Putin's meat grinder approach. That means that Russia could easily be down by 2 million people by the time the war ends. It's already down by 1.7 million, according to Newsweek. And these are all people who won't be contributing to the country's economy once the war ends. In short, Russia has a labor crisis, a crisis that was already happening before the war started. The situation is so bad that the country was short by 4.8 million workers by 2023, with that problem only getting worse through 2024. The result, according to Reuters, will be stunted economic growth at a time when Russia is burning through its cash reserves and its people to keep the war going. So where does all of this leave Russia? Regress and potential bankruptcy seems inevitable. Russia is running out of workers to the point where some commentators believe that a key condition of its recently signed defensive pact with North Korea is that Pyongyang delivers labor to Russia. Filling that massive gap in the country's workforce will take time, as will revitalizing the industries that have been placed on the back burner as the country's economy has transformed to focus on the war. A war that's costing hundreds of millions of dollars per day. All while the weight of economic sanctions bears down, direct investment has slowed to a crawl. The country's national reserves are being drained to the point where they'll likely be empty within 12 months. Russia is defaulting on its debt, and the economic challenges it faces in terms of its relationship with the rest of the world aren't simply going to go away when the war ends. Sanctions and trade challenges will persist long after. And of course, regular people will feel the brunt of this bankruptcy. Rampant inflation is raising the cost of living substantially, with high rates of interest making it more difficult to borrow money. It all adds up to Russia heading for an economic fall, one you might never predict if you took its current growth figures at face value. But what do you think? Is the economic picture as grim as it appears for Russia, or will it be able to pull itself out of its financial hole once the war ends?